We don't serve beggars here. My sister's voice cut through the bank lobby like a knife loud enough for everyone to hear. $50. That's all I'd asked for. But Victoria, the bank manager in her designer suit and perfect makeup, wanted to make sure the entire room knew I didn't belong. Elderly clients looked away. Employees pretended to be busy. I stood there, 24 years old, feeling like I was 12 again. The unwanted daughter, the family mistake, the sister who deserved nothing. But what Victoria didn't know, what no one in that marble lobby knew, was that I'd just returned to town for one reason. And it wasn't to beg for $50. I reached into my bag and placed a legal document on the counter. In that case, I said quietly, I'd like to withdraw the full Eleanor Parker Trust. The teller's fingers froze over her keyboard. All $4.5 billion. The system alert that screamed across every terminal in that bank. That was the sound of my sister's world ending. The federal preservation order that locked down every file, every record, every secret she thought was buried. That was just the beginning. Because the $50 humiliation wasn't random cruelty. It was calculated. Orchestrated by the same man who killed my father 25 years ago and has been stealing from a trust meant to protect the elderly ever since. And my sister, she wasn't just complicit. She was the weapon. What happens when you back a woman into a corner, strip away her dignity, and assume she has nothing left to lose? You're about to find out. This is the story of how I made my sister drop to her knees and beg not for mercy, but for truth. And trust me, you won't believe where this ends. My name is Rachel Parker. I'm 24 years old, and until 3 months ago, I worked as a case manager at Elder Advocacy Network in San Francisco, helping senior citizens navigate the complexities of trust law and financial abuse. I never imagined that everything I learned protecting strangers would become the weapon I'd need to protect myself, or that the greatest threat to my life would be wearing my own last name. The morning of December 2nd, 2024, I walked into Riverside Community Bank for the first time in 7 years, and the building looked exactly as I remembered, all marble floors and brass fixtures, the kind of old money architecture designed to make you feel either important or insignificant, depending on which side of the counter you stood. I chose my outfit deliberately that morning. A simple charcoal blazer from Target Minimal Jewelry, my dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. I wanted to blend in, to be unremarkable, to be exactly the kind of person no one would remember seeing. The request I made to the young teller was straightforward enough. I'd like to withdraw $50 from my personal checking account, please. It was a test, really. A small gesture to see how the waters had changed in the 7 years since I'd left this town and everyone in it behind. The teller, a nervous young woman who couldn't have been more than 20, pulled up my account without hesitation. Her fingers were moving across the keyboard to process the transaction when a voice I hadn't heard in those 7 years sliced through the quiet lobby like a blade. "I'll handle this." I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Some voices settle into your bones during childhood and never quite leave. Victoria Parker, my half-sister, emerged from her glass-walled office with the kind of purposeful stride that announced she was doing someone a favor by paying attention to them. She was 22 now, and the years had been kind in the way they are to people who've never had to question whether they deserve kindness. Her designer suit probably cost more than I'd spent on clothes in the past year. Her blonde hair was styled in those perfect waves that require either genetics or a very expensive salon, and knowing Victoria, it was both. The teller stepped back immediately, and I watched Victoria position herself behind the counter like a general claiming territory. This was her domain, her bank, her power, and I was supposed to understand that the moment I saw her. "Rachel." My name came out of her mouth like she was identifying something unpleasant she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "I didn't realize you were back in town?" "Just visiting," I said quietly, my hands folded on the marble counter. I kept my voice even, unremarkable. Let her think I was still the same girl who'd left 7 years ago, beaten down, eager to escape, willing to disappear rather than fight. Victoria picked up my account information from the teller's screen, her perfectly manicured fingernails clicking against the mouse. She made a show of reviewing it, her lips pursing in what I recognized as her signature expression of disapproval. Then she raised her voice, not quite shouting, but loud enough that every person in that lobby would hear her clearly. "We don't serve individuals with insufficient account standing at this institution." The words landed exactly as she'd intended them to. Heads turned. An elderly woman waiting at the new accounts desk looked up sharply, her expression shifting from curiosity to discomfort. A businessman by the ATM paused mid-transaction. Even the security guard near the entrance straightened slightly, his attention drawn to the drama unfolding at the main counter. Insufficient account standing. It was a lie, of course. My account had over $3,000 in it, modest by Riverside standards, perhaps, but hardly insufficient. But Victoria wasn't making a financial assessment. She was making a social one. She was telling everyone in that lobby that I didn't belong here, that I was somehow less than that my very presence in this building was an imposition they were all being forced to tolerate. I felt the familiar heat of humiliation crawl up my neck, the same feeling I'd experienced countless times growing up in a house where I was always the afterthought, always the one who didn't quite fit. But I'd spent 7 years in California learning to recognize that feeling for what it was, not truth, but a weapon. And I'd also spent 7 years learning exactly how to disarm it. So I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't give Victoria the satisfaction of seeing me flustered or angry or hurt. Instead, I remained perfectly still, my expression neutral, and I watched. I counted the security cameras positioned around the lobby, 4 that I could see, probably more in the back offices. I noted which employees looked away uncomfortable with what they were witnessing and which ones seemed to enjoy the spectacle. I measured the slight tremor in Victoria's hand as she waved dismissively toward the exit, as if she were shooing away a stray dog. That tremor told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just cruelty for cruelty's sake. This was fear dressed up as authority. Victoria was afraid of me, even if she didn't fully understand why yet. And that fear was about to become very, very justified. I reached into my leather portfolio, the one nice piece of professional equipment I'd invested in during my years at Elder Advocacy, and pulled out a sealed legal envelope. It was official, stamped by the Massachusetts Probate and Family Court, impossible to ignore or dismiss as personal drama. I placed it on the marble counter between us with the kind of quiet deliberation that made the gesture feel significant. In that case, I said, my tone conversational, almost friendly, "Please transfer this request to your Trust and Estate Compliance Officer." The shift in the room was immediate. Trust and estate. Those words meant something in a town like Riverside, where old money and family legacies were managed through complex legal instruments most people never fully understood. The businessman at the ATM looked over again, more interested now. The elderly woman at the new accounts desk leaned forward slightly, straining to hear. The teller's fingers, which had been hovering uncertainly over her keyboard, now froze completely. A red notification banner appeared across her screen. I couldn't see exactly what it said, but I watched her eyes widen as she read it. Whatever automatic protocol my legal filing had triggered, it was working exactly as my attorney had promised it would. Victoria's carefully constructed expression of superior dismissal cracked. Just slightly, just for a moment, but I saw it. She reached for the envelope, and I noticed her hand wasn't quite steady as she broke the seal. Then I placed a second document on the counter. This one wasn't sealed. This one was meant to be read publicly, and I made sure to speak clearly enough that every person in that lobby, every customer, every employee, every witness to my humiliation would hear me. "I'm formally requesting a complete accounting of the Eleanor Parker Trust. I believe you're familiar with it, Victoria. All $4.5 billion of it." The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. The look on Victoria's face in that moment, the absolute shock, the dawning horror, the realization that the sister she'd just publicly humiliated wasn't some desperate woman begging for scraps that look made 7 years of silence worth it. But to understand how I got to that marble counter with those documents in my hand, you need to understand where I came from. And more importantly, you need to understand why I left. Riverside, Massachusetts is the kind of town where your family name determines your worth before you're old enough to spell it. Victoria and I grew up in the same sprawling Tudor mansion on Elmwood Drive, attended the same private academy where tuition cost more than most people's annual salary, and sat at the same mahogany dining table every Sunday for family dinners that felt more like performance reviews than meals. But we might as well have been living in different universes. When Victoria was 7 and I was 9, she had a piano recital at the Riverside Cultural Center. Our mother invited 23 people, grandparents, cousins, family friends, even our father's business associates. They filled 3 rows of the auditorium and applauded enthusiastically when Victoria played a slightly off-key version of a Mozart sonata. I'd won the regional science fair that same week with a project on water purification systems. My parents didn't attend the award ceremony. When I brought home the first place ribbon and tried to show my mother, she glanced at it and said, "That's nice, dear. Did you remember to thank your teacher for the help?" I hadn't needed help. I'd designed the entire system myself. But that distinction didn't seem to matter. Victoria's acceptance to Yale arrived with champagne and a garden party that summer. My full scholarship to UC Berkeley, a school that actually had a better program for what I wanted to study, was acknowledged with a tight smile from my mother and a single comment: "California. That's very far away." My father nodded and returned to his newspaper. The unspoken message was clear. Distance was exactly what they preferred. The comparisons were never explicit, which somehow made them more poisonous. "Victoria has such natural grace," my mother would observe at family gatherings, watching my sister work a room with practiced charm. The corollary that I lacked whatever quality made someone worthy of attention hung in the air unspoken, but understood by everyone, including me. By the time I was 12, I'd stopped trying to earn their approval. By 16, I'd stopped believing I deserved it. And by 17, when I boarded that plane to San Francisco for my freshman year, I'd made a decision I would build a life that required absolutely nothing from Riverside or the people who'd made me feel invisible in my own home. California was a revelation. Nobody at Berkeley knew my family. Nobody cared about the Parker name or what it meant in some small New England town 3,000 miles away. I could be whoever I chose to be, and I chose to be someone who would never again depend on anyone else's estimation of my worth. I double majored in finance and legal studies, not because I loved accounting or contracts, but because I understood that knowledge is power when you have no other inheritance. I graduated summa cum laude. My parents didn't attend the ceremony. After graduation, I joined Elder Advocacy Network, a nonprofit in San Francisco that specialized in protecting senior citizens from financial abuse. The salary was modest, barely enough to cover my tiny studio apartment in the Tenderloin, but the work was everything. I learned to read trust documents the way detectives read crime scenes, identifying patterns of exploitation buried in dense legal language. I learned to spot the warning signs adult children who suddenly showed interest in elderly parents they'd ignored for years, caregivers who isolated their charges from family financial advisors who charged excessive fees for minimal services, institutions that looked the other way because victims were too old or too confused to fight back. Over 7 years, I documented dozens of cases. The son who forged his mother's signature to drain her retirement account. The nursing home administrator who systematically overcharged dementia patients for services never provided. The trustee who issued himself low-interest loans from an estate he was supposed to be protecting. I helped prosecute them, testified in court, watched them face consequences. I became very, very good at recognizing how predators operate in the world of elder finance. I never once connected what I was learning to my own family. I never thought to look at the Eleanor Parker Trust, the legendary family fortune I'd heard whispered about my entire childhood, but never really understood with the same critical eye I applied to my cases. Why would I? I was the forgotten daughter, the one who'd been erased from family consideration long before I left for California. Whatever happened with family money, I assumed I had no part in it. Then Eleanor called. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September. I was reviewing case files in my cramped office when my cell phone rang with a Massachusetts number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I'd trained myself not to answer calls from that area code, but something made me pick up. "Rachel, it's Eleanor." My great-aunt's voice sounded different than I remembered, thinner, strained, like speaking required effort she could barely afford. Eleanor had always been the anomaly in our family, the one person who actually seemed to care whether I existed. She sent birthday cards when my own parents forgot. She asked about my life in California, like she genuinely wanted to know. She was the only member of the Parker family I'd stayed in contact with, trading occasional emails and phone calls over the years. "I need you to come home," she said, and I heard her take a shaky breath. "I'm sick, Rachel. Stage 4 cancer. The doctors are saying 3 to 6 months, but that's optimistic." My chest tightened. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry. I'll book a flight this week. I can take some time off." "That's not why I'm calling." Her voice dropped lower, and I heard the sound of a door closing, like she was making sure no one could overhear. "There's something wrong with the trust, Rachel. The Eleanor Parker Trust. Something very wrong. I've been noticing irregularities for years, but I didn't have the expertise to understand what I was seeing. You do. You're the only person I can trust to look at this properly, and I'm running out of time." I sat up straighter, my case manager instincts immediately alert. "What kind of irregularities?" "The kind that involve missing millions, forged signatures, loans that don't make sense, and a pattern of decisions that all benefit one person, Charles Montgomery." She paused. "Your grandfather." I booked a flight that evening, telling my supervisor I needed emergency family leave. I thought I was coming home to help Eleanor uncover financial mismanagement. I thought I was flying back to use my professional skills to protect someone I loved. I had no idea I was walking into a war that had started before I was born. Eleanor's final words before hanging up that September afternoon were barely a whisper spoken so quietly I almost didn't hear them. "Your father didn't die in an accident, Rachel, and the people who killed him are still in control of everything you should have inherited." The chaos I'd unleashed in that bank lobby was still reverberating 3 days later when I finally sat down with Eleanor to understand exactly what I'd stepped into. Victoria had gone pale, stammered something about needing to speak with her supervisor, and disappeared into her office while security cameras recorded every moment. The teller had printed out my formal request with shaking hands, and I'd walked out of Riverside Community Bank knowing I'd just lit a fuse but not yet understanding the size of the bomb. Eleanor's Victorian home on Prescott Street looked smaller than I remembered from childhood visits, though maybe that was just because Eleanor herself seemed to have diminished. The woman who'd once seemed so vibrant, so unshakably present, was now drowning in medical equipment. The sunroom where we used to have tea was cluttered with oxygen tanks, prescription bottles arranged in careful rows on the windowsill, and a hospital bed that had replaced the antique settee. The December light filtering through the old, wavy glass windows made everything look fragile, temporary. She was waiting for me in her wheelchair, wrapped in a thick cardigan despite the warmth of the room. When I walked in, she smiled that same warm, genuine smile that had been the only brightness in my childhood, but I could see the effort it cost her. Stage 4. Cancer doesn't just attack the body. It consumes everything except what's absolutely essential. And what was essential to Eleanor, I was beginning to understand, was making sure I knew the truth before she ran out of time to tell it. "Thank you for coming back," she said, her voice thin but steady. "I know this town holds nothing but bad memories for you." I pulled up a chair beside her, close enough to take her hand. It felt like holding a bundle of twigs wrapped in tissue paper. "You called. Of course I came. But Eleanor, what you told me on the phone about my father, about the trust I need to understand what's really happening here." She nodded slowly, gathering her strength, and I recognized the look in her eyes. I'd seen it before in my work, elderly clients preparing to tell me things they'd kept secret for decades, steeling themselves to speak truths that had been festering in silence. Eleanor had rehearsed this conversation in her mind 1,000 times, I realized. She'd been waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right reason to finally break her silence. "The Eleanor Parker Trust," she began, her voice taking on the precise quality of someone reciting facts. "They need me to understand exactly, was established in 1950 by our grandfather Edmund Parker. He was a self-made man, built his fortune in textiles and manufacturing, believed that wealth carried responsibility. The trust was his legacy, designed with two missions: first, to ensure that no Parker family member would ever suffer financial hardship, and second, to fund senior care initiatives throughout New England. Nursing homes, medical research, advocacy programs. Over 75 years, through careful investment and contributions from each generation, the trust grew to $4.5 billion. She paused, catching her breath, and I noticed how even this simple explanation exhausted her. But she pressed on, determined. "Beautiful words, Rachel. Beautiful intentions. All enshrined in legal documents that are supposed to protect both the family and the vulnerable seniors we're meant to serve. But I've learned something in my 68 years. Beautiful words can hide the ugliest realities. And the trust that was supposed to protect people has become a weapon." Before I could ask what she meant, the doorbell rang. Eleanor's eyes brightened slightly. "That'll be Margaret. I asked her to bring everything." Margaret Chen turned out to be a woman in her mid-60s with steel-gray hair cut in a no-nonsense bob and eyes that missed nothing. She carried herself with the controlled intensity of a prosecutor, and when she set a banker's box down on Eleanor's coffee table with a solid thud, I heard the rattle of documents that meant someone had been building a case. "Rachel Parker," she said, extending her hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong. "I've heard a lot about you. Eleanor says you work in elder financial advocacy in California." 7 years, I confirmed. "Specializing in trust abuse cases." Margaret's smile was grim. "Then you're going to recognize what you're about to see. The patterns, the techniques, the systematic theft disguised as legitimate management." She began spreading documents across Eleanor's coffee table, arranging them with the precision of someone laying out evidence for a jury. Bank statements, investment reports, loan agreements, fee schedules, each one highlighted, annotated, cross-referenced. "The accounting is technically legal," Margaret said, her voice carrying that controlled anger I recognized from attorneys who've watched too many guilty people walk free. "But it's morally bankrupt. Look at the management fees." I leaned forward, my professional training kicking in automatically. The trust documents showed fees of 2.5% annually. My stomach dropped. "That's excessive. Industry standard for a trust this size should be around 0.5%, maybe 0.75 at most." "Exactly," Margaret confirmed. "That's $12 million per year disappearing into administrative costs. But it gets worse." She pulled out another folder. "Loans. $87 million total issued to something called Community Development Partnerships. No collateral, no credit checks, no repayment schedules, no documentation of what these partnerships actually are or what they've developed." I picked up one of the loan agreements, scanning the terms with growing disbelief. It was every red flag I'd learned to recognize in my years at Elder Advocacy Network, all wrapped up in a single document. "Who approved these?" Single signature on every one. Margaret tapped the bottom of the page where a bold, confident signature sprawled across the approval line. "Charles Montgomery, trustee for 30 years, your grandfather, Victoria's grandfather, the man who's controlled this entire trust since before you were born." Eleanor's voice, quiet but firm, cut through my mounting horror. "There's something else you need to know, Rachel. Something about you specifically." I looked up from the documents, and the expression on her face made my chest tighten. "You weren't supposed to be in this trust," she said. "When your father David died 25 years ago, his portion was meant to revert to charity. That was the original language in Edmund's founding documents. But 6 months after David's death, Charles personally amended the trust. He created a new provision bloodline inheritance for David's descendants with assets managed by the trustee until the heir reaches 25 years old. The math hit me like a physical blow. I'd turned 24 last month. In less than a year, I would have the legal right to demand direct access to my portion of the trust. Approximately $1.8 billion. He didn't add you out of generosity, Eleanor continued, her eyes holding mine with an intensity that burned through her physical weakness. He added you because he needed you inside the trust where he could control you, watch you, and if necessary— She stopped, her voice catching. Eliminate me, I finished quietly. Just like he eliminated my father. Margaret cleared her throat, the sound heavy with meaning. There's one more thing. She turned her laptop toward me, pulling up a scanned document. We requested the full police file from your father's accident. Not just the public report, but everything: witness statements, investigation notes, supplementary files. There was a witness who saw another vehicle near the bridge that night. Someone who might have seen what really happened. My eyes found the name at the bottom of the witness statement, and the world seemed to tilt sideways. Eleanor Parker. I looked at my aunt, this woman who'd been the only source of warmth in my childhood, who'd called me back to Riverside, who was dying and desperate to make things right. You saw, I whispered. You saw what happened to my father, and you never told anyone. Eleanor's face crumpled, 25 years of guilt and fear finally breaking through. I tried once, 5 years after David died. I sent everything to the FBI, the witness statement, the financial irregularities, all of it. They investigated for 3 weeks. Then Charles walked into their office with his lawyer and documents proving I was mentally unstable, financially motivated, and possibly involved in a conspiracy to defraud the trust. The investigation closed, and I learned that Charles had been preparing for my betrayal from the very beginning. The silence in Eleanor's sunroom stretched between us like a chasm. My aunt, who'd been the only warmth in my cold childhood, had witnessed something related to my father's death and buried it for 25 years. Part of me wanted to be angry to demand why she'd stayed silent, but the look on her face stopped me. This wasn't the expression of someone who'd made a choice. This was the face of someone who'd been crushed by circumstances too powerful to fight. Tell me everything, I said quietly. From the beginning. I need to understand what really happened to my father. Eleanor closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were wet with tears that had been waiting decades to fall. Your father was 28 years old in the spring of 2000, newly married to your mother Anna. You were on the way, she was 7 months pregnant. David had just been appointed to the trust board as its youngest member in history. Our grandfather Edmund had started a tradition that each generation should have representation, and David was brilliant, principled, everything the Parker family claimed to value. She paused to take a labored breath, and I waited, watching her gather strength. He took the responsibility seriously, too seriously as it turned out. Most trustees just showed up to quarterly meetings, signed whatever Charles put in front of them, collected their stipend, and went home. But David actually read the financial reports. He started asking questions that made Charles uncomfortable. Why were administrative costs increasing so dramatically? We'd gone from $2 million annually to nearly $10 million in just 5 years. Who were these community development partners receiving loans with such favorable terms? Why was there no documentation of the charitable impact we were supposedly having? Margaret, who'd been quietly organizing documents, added. Charles tried to brush him off at first, called it youthful inexperience, said trust management was more complex than David understood. But your father wasn't someone who accepted dismissals easily. No, Eleanor agreed, a sad smile crossing her face. David hired an independent auditor with his own money. He submitted formal requests for 75 years of financial records under his rights as a trustee. And what he found— her voice broke. What he found was a pattern of systematic theft disguised as management, loans to shell companies that existed only on paper, fees paid to consulting firms that had no employees, money disappearing into investment vehicles that led nowhere. I felt my professional training clicking into place, seeing the structure of the crime Eleanor was describing. It was textbook embezzlement, the kind of scheme I'd helped prosecute a dozen times in California. But this wasn't some anonymous case file. This was my family, my father, my grandfather. David realized that Charles wasn't just being negligent, Eleanor continued. He was running a sophisticated operation to drain the trust while maintaining the appearance of legitimate management. And the charitable mission, the senior care, the scholarships, all those beautiful programs Edmund had envisioned. They were real, but they were also cover. Charles could point to the good work being done and say, "How dare you question my management when we're helping so many people?" But the truth was, he was helping himself to millions in the process. What did David do? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. He confronted his father. March 14th, 2000. I know the exact date because David called me right afterward. I'd never heard him sound like that, furious and terrified at the same time. Eleanor's hands trembled in her lap. He told me everything. How Charles denied it all, at first acted offended that his own son would make such accusations. But then something shifted. Charles got very quiet, very still, and he stopped denying. Instead, he said something that David recorded in his notes, word for word. "You don't understand what you're threatening to destroy. This family, your mother, your brother, your pregnant wife, everything depends on maintaining the integrity of this trust. If you expose me, we don't just lose money. We lose everything. And I will not allow you to destroy what I've spent 30 years building." The threat was barely veiled, but I could imagine how a 28-year-old idealist might not fully grasp the danger he was in. Did David back down? Never. Eleanor's voice held both pride and grief. He gave Charles 48 hours to agree to 3 conditions: full restitution of any embezzled funds, immediate implementation of independent oversight, and Charles's resignation as trustee. Charles asked for time to make arrangements. David thought that meant his father was going to comply. But he wasn't, I said quietly. 36 hours later, David's car went off a bridge on Route 44 during a rainstorm. He was driving home from a late meeting. The official police investigation concluded it was a tragic accident. Wet roads, reduced visibility speed, possibly a factor. The car went through a guardrail and plunged 40 feet into the Riverside Gorge. David died on impact. No evidence of foul play. No reason to suspect anything other than a terrible accident. Margaret pulled out another document, sliding it across to me. Except the police report notes that David's brake system had been serviced just 3 days before the accident. The mechanic certified everything was in perfect working order. Yet somehow on that rainy night the brakes failed catastrophically. "You saw something," I said, looking at Eleanor. "The night before. What did you see?" Eleanor's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I was visiting David and Anna for dinner. I left around 9 p.m. As I was pulling out of their driveway, I saw Charles's car parked down the street, unusual because he lived on the other side of town. I circled back and saw Charles in David's garage. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was just checking on the car's maintenance. Father's prerogative, wanted to make sure his son was keeping up with safety inspections. It seemed odd but not suspicious. Not then." "But after the accident," I prompted. "After the accident, when the police said the brakes failed despite being recently serviced, I started connecting pieces. I gave a statement to the investigating officer, mentioned seeing Charles near David's car. But my statement was filed away as supplementary, never followed up on. The official cause was driver error combined with poor weather conditions. Case closed." "You tried to report it later," I said, remembering what Margaret had mentioned. Eleanor nodded. 2005. 5 years of living with the guilt, the suspicion, the knowledge that I'd seen something important and hadn't pushed hard enough. I put together everything I could: copies of David's financial findings, my witness statement, a timeline of suspicious circumstances. I sent it all to the FBI anonymously. And I asked, though the fact that Charles was still free told me how that had ended. 3 weeks later, 2 agents showed up at my office. They interviewed me for 2 hours. I thought finally someone was taking this seriously. Then Charles walked in with Martin Vance, his attorney. They had documents I'd never seen before, emails supposedly from me to David, discussing how we could fabricate evidence against Charles' bank statements, showing suspicious transactions in my account's medical records, suggesting I was experiencing stress-related cognitive problems. Eleanor's voice hardened. All of it was fake. Sophisticated forgeries created to discredit me before I could even make my case. The FBI agents apologized for wasting my time, suggested I might want to seek counseling for my grief, and closed the investigation. He was ready for you, I said, the pieces falling into place. Charles had been preparing for the possibility of exposure from the moment he killed David. He's always 3 steps ahead, Margaret confirmed. That's what makes him so dangerous. He doesn't just commit crimes, he builds infrastructure around them. Fake documents waiting to be deployed. Allies in positions of power. Narrative control. By the time you realize you're fighting him, he's already written the story of why you can't be trusted. Eleanor reached for the locked drawer of the table beside her wheelchair. Her hands shook so badly that Margaret had to help her turn the key. Inside was a single envelope yellowed with age, sealed with red wax that had cracked but never broken. The handwriting on the front was masculine, decisive. For my child, David Parker. March 15, 2000, the day after he confronted Charles. The day before he died. Eleanor held it out to me and I saw tears streaming down her face. Your father knew he was going to die, Rachel. Maybe not consciously, but some part of him understood the danger he was in. He gave this to me the morning after the confrontation with Charles, made me promise to keep it safe and give it to his child if anything happened to him. I've carried this for 25 years. I've been too afraid to open it, too afraid of what it might mean, too afraid that knowing for certain would destroy whatever fragile peace I'd managed to build with my cowardice. I took the envelope with hands that weren't quite steady. The wax seal bore the impression of a signet ring, the Parker family crest. My father's ring. You're not me, Rachel, Eleanor said, her voice stronger now despite the tears. You're David. You have his courage, his refusal to accept injustice, and you're not afraid anymore. Open it. Read what your father wanted you to know, and then finish what he started. I left Eleanor's house that afternoon with my father's sealed envelope in my bag and a clarity I'd never experienced before. Some people might have cried. Others might have raged, screamed, demanded immediate confrontation. But 7 years of working elder abuse cases had taught me something crucial. Emotion is a weapon your opponent uses against you. Methodical preparation wins cases. Evidence wins cases. Making the system do what it's designed to do, protect the vulnerable, that's what wins cases. I didn't open my father's letter that night. Instead, I opened my laptop and started building a team. Margaret Chen agreed to stay on as lead attorney within the first hour of our conversation. We met at a quiet cafe 40 minutes outside Riverside, away from anyone who might recognize us. She'd spent 30 years watching powerful people manipulate trust law to exploit the elderly, and I could see in her eyes that this case meant something beyond a paycheck. I've been waiting for someone with standing to challenge Charles Montgomery, she told me, stirring her coffee with the focused intensity of someone who'd been planning this moment for years. You're not just a beneficiary. You're David Parker's daughter. That means something legally, but it also means something symbolically. Charles buried your father to protect his theft. Now David's daughter is going to dig up everything he tried to hide. The second member of my team came through Margaret's recommendation. Robert Torres was a forensic accountant based in Boston who'd built his entire career prosecuting white-collar criminals. When Margaret mentioned his name, I recognized it immediately. He'd testified in a case I'd followed 3 years ago involving a financial advisor who'd embezzled $12 million from elderly clients' retirement accounts. Robert had been the expert witness who'd traced every stolen dollar through layers of shell companies and offshore accounts. When I called him and explained the basics of the Eleanor Parker Trust situation, his response was immediate. I'm in. My grandfather lost his pension to a family trust scheme in the 90s. Trustee claimed market losses while buying himself a yacht. I've wanted to take down someone like your grandfather for 20 years. Diana Okafor, the private investigator, was the final piece. She ran a small firm in Boston that specialized exclusively in financial elder abuse cases, tracking down missing assets, documenting patterns of exploitation, finding the paper trails that families and institutions claimed didn't exist. When I met her in her cramped office above a Vietnamese restaurant, she listened to my 30-minute summary of the situation without interrupting once. Then she leaned back in her chair and said, "My aunt died penniless in a state facility while her trust paid administrative fees to the cousin who was supposed to be protecting her. I watched my mother try to fight it through the courts and get crushed by lawyers who billed $400 an hour while claiming there was no money left to investigate. So yes, I'll help you, and I won't stop until we've documented every dollar your grandfather stole." None of them worked cheap. Margaret's retainer alone was $50,000. Robert's forensic analysis would run another $40,000. Diana's investigative work would cost at least $30,000, possibly more, depending on what we uncovered. But Eleanor had personal funds separate from the trust money she'd saved over decades, money that wasn't under Charles's control. She transferred $200,000 to an account in my name with instructions, "Use whatever you need. This is what your father would have wanted." Our strategy, which we finalized over a 12-hour planning session in Margaret's office, was elegant in its simplicity. We weren't going to accuse anyone of crimes. We weren't going to make dramatic public allegations. We were simply going to invoke my legal rights as a trust beneficiary under Massachusetts Uniform Trust Code Section 813. Any beneficiary can petition for a complete accounting of trust activities, and the trustee is legally required to comply within 30 days. It's not aggressive litigation. It's basic transparency, the kind of thing that should happen routinely in well-managed trusts. But here's what makes it powerful: the moment that petition is filed, automatic protocols activate. The bank managing the trust must preserve all records. Emails can't be deleted. Transaction logs can't be modified. Security footage must be maintained. Any attempt to destroy or alter evidence after a preservation order becomes a federal crime under obstruction of justice statutes. We weren't attacking the castle. We were politely asking them to open the doors and let us look inside. And if there was rot when there was rot, it would expose itself. Robert started with the publicly available information, the tax filings that every charitable trust must submit annually. What he found in the first 48 hours was damning enough to justify everything we were planning. The Eleanor Parker Trust claimed $12 million in annual management fees. But trust law is clear: fees must be reasonable compensation for actual work performed. For a trust this size, even with complex investments, reasonable fees should be $2 to $3 million maximum. Where was the other $9 million going every single year? Then Robert found the loans. 4 separate transactions between 2019 and 2023, totaling $80 million, issued to entities called Riverside Development Partners, New England Community Fund, Senior Care Initiatives, LLC, and Parker Legacy Foundation. No credit history for any of them. No collateral backing the loans. Interest rates of 0.5%, absurdly below market rate. And every single approval signature belonged to Victoria Parker Trust Operations Manager. Robert looked up from his laptop when he showed me this, his expression grim. "Your sister signed off on $80 million in fraudulent loans. Either she knew exactly what she was doing or someone set her up to take the fall." I studied the signatures, comparing them across documents. They looked identical, too identical. When did Victoria get signatory authority? According to the bank's corporate records, she was promoted to Trust Operations Manager in March 2021. That's when she received limited signing authority for transactions under $5 million. But these loans were approved in 2019 and 2020. I said, seeing the problem immediately, 2 years before she had authority to sign anything. Exactly, Robert confirmed, which means either the documents were backdated after Victoria received authority, or someone forged her signature using a stamp or digital copy. Either way, it's a felony. And whether your sister knows it or not, she's sitting at the center of a crime that could send her to prison for 10 years. I thought about Victoria's face in that bank lobby, the tremor in her hand, the fear I'd seen beneath her cruelty. She'd been so confident in her superiority, so certain of her power. But what if she was just as much a victim of Charles's manipulation as I was? What if my sister wasn't the villain I'd assumed she was, but another weapon he'd crafted and aimed at anyone who threatened his control? That night back in my hotel room, I was reviewing the documentation Robert had compiled when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Silence on the other end. Then a voice I hadn't heard in 7 years, tight with something that might have been fear or anger or both. "Rachel, it's your mother." I said nothing, waiting. "Please," Anna said, and I heard her take a shaky breath. "Stop whatever you're doing. Come to dinner tomorrow night. Just you, me, and James. No lawyers, no documents. We can fix this as a family." The word family hit me like a slap. I considered the offer for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to remember every family dinner where I'd been invisible, every achievement, ignored every moment of erasure disguised as normal. "Mother," I said quietly, "we stopped being a family the day you married the brother of the man you watched die. I'll see you in court." I hung up before she could respond. Diana, who'd been working on her laptop across the room, looked up sharply. "Rachel, you need to see this. I found the complete police file from your father's accident, including the witness statements that were buried in supplementary files." She turned her screen toward me, and I saw Eleanor's statement from March 2000, describing in detail seeing Charles Montgomery near David Parker's vehicle the night before the fatal crash. "Someone made sure this never saw daylight," Diana said, "and I think I know who." 2 weeks after Diana showed me that buried witness statement, after Robert had compiled his forensic analysis of the trust's suspicious transactions, after Margaret had drafted and filed every legal document with meticulous precision, I walked back into Riverside Community Bank on a Monday morning. This time I knew exactly what I was doing. This time I was ready for war. The preparation had been exhausting. Margaret spent 60 hours drafting the petition for accounting, making sure every citation was perfect, every argument airtight. Robert created spreadsheets documenting every questionable transaction, every excessive fee, every loan that violated basic fiduciary standards. Diana tracked down 3 other families who'd had similar experiences with trusts managed by Charles' elderly people who'd watched their inheritances evaporate into administrative costs while being told everything was perfectly legal. We built a case so solid that even the best attorneys couldn't dismiss it as family drama or personal vendetta. And now it was time to spring the trap. I approached the same teller window where I'd stood 2 weeks earlier, wearing another unremarkable outfit, navy blazer, simple blouse, the kind of professional but not threatening look I'd perfected during my years in nonprofit work. The young teller recognized me immediately. I saw her eyes widen slightly, saw her glance nervously toward Victoria's glass office. "Good morning," I said pleasantly. "I'd like to withdraw $100 from my checking account, please." The lobby wasn't crowded 10:30 on a Monday morning, typically wasn't peak banking time, but there were enough people present to make what happened next matter. An elderly couple at the new accounts desk, a businessman at the loan officer's station, 3 people waiting in the teller line behind me, and most importantly, Mrs. Patricia Hendricks, a 74-year-old woman I'd never met but whose name Diana had flagged in her research. Patricia's sister had lost $200,000 to a trust managed by one of Charles's associates. She knew exactly what financial abuse looked like. The teller's fingers were moving toward her keyboard when that sharp voice cut through the lobby again. "I'll handle this." Victoria emerged from her office with the same purposeful stride, the same designer suit, the same attempt at commanding authority. But something was different this time. Her smile was tighter, more forced. Her voice pitched slightly higher, like she was working harder to maintain the performance. She positioned herself behind the counter and pulled up my account information, and I watched her hands. 2 weeks ago there'd been a slight tremor. Today her fingers were visibly shaking. "Rachel." My name came out clipped professional, but I heard the stress underneath. Back so soon. Just need a small withdrawal, I said evenly. $100. Victoria's jaw tightened. She glanced at my account balance, still over $3,000, and then made her choice. She was going to repeat the same script, the same public humiliation because it had worked before. Or because she'd been told to. Or because she didn't know what else to do. We maintain certain standards for client interactions at this institution, she announced, her voice carrying across the lobby. Standards that ensure we're serving clients with legitimate banking needs rather than what? The question came from Mrs. Patricia Hendricks, who'd stood up from the new accounts desk and was walking toward us. Rather than family members who ask questions, that's exactly what they told my sister before they drained her account. Victoria's head snapped toward Patricia, color draining from her face. Ma'am, I don't know what you're referring to. I'm referring to trust managers who use intimidation instead of transparency. Patricia said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived enough to stop caring about propriety. I've seen this before, young lady, and it doesn't end well. The businessman at the loan desk was watching now. The elderly couple had stopped their conversation. Even the teller had gone very still, her eyes darting between Victoria and me like she was watching a car accident in slow motion. I reached into my portfolio and placed a legal document on the marble counter. The Massachusetts Probate and Family Court seal was clearly visible, stamped in official blue ink. This is a formal petition for trust accounting under Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 203E, Section 813. I said, my voice calm and clear. As a named beneficiary of the Eleanor Parker Trust, I'm requesting complete financial records for the past 10 years. All distributions, all investments, all fees, and all loans. The trustee has 30 days to comply with this legally mandated request. Victoria stared at the document like it was a snake that had just appeared on the counter. I slid a second document across the marble. And this is a preservation order issued this morning by Judge Patricia Morrison. All trust-related records, physical and digital, must be maintained in their current state pending review. Any modification or deletion of records after this moment is a federal offense under 18 U.S.C. Section 1519, obstruction of justice. The teller's computer made a soft, chiming sound. A red banner appeared across her screen, then across every terminal visible in the lobby. The preservation order had entered the bank's system, automatically triggered by keywords and case numbers that Margaret had carefully embedded in the filing. Every employee with access to trust records would now see that banner. Every transaction would be logged. Every email would be preserved. Victoria's facade didn't just crack, it shattered. Her hand trembled violently as she reached for the documents. She read the first page, then the second, her complexion shifting from pink to gray to a sickly white. You can't just— this is family business, Rachel. Private family business. The words came out desperate, pleading, nothing like the authoritative dismissal she'd wielded 2 weeks ago. The Eleanor Parker Trust is not a family business, I said quietly, but my voice carried across the lobby to every witness. It's a charitable trust registered with the state of Massachusetts, subject to public oversight and fiduciary law. If it's been managed appropriately, a simple accounting should take a week. If it hasn't— I let the implication hang in the air between us. Victoria looked toward her office, and I knew exactly what she was thinking. She needed to make a phone call. She needed to alert Charles that everything he'd built over 30 years was about to be exposed. She needed instructions, reassurance, someone to tell her what to do. She practically ran to her office, and through the glass walls I watched her snatch up the phone. Diana had installed monitoring software on the bank's external call logs, perfectly legal since we'd gotten court permission as part of the preservation order. 17 seconds. That's how long Victoria's call to Charles Montgomery lasted. 17 seconds to say, Rachel's here with legal documents, and hear whatever instruction he gave in return. 4 minutes later, I was still standing at the counter, calmly reviewing the teller's copy of my documents when I heard it. The sound of an expensive engine pulling into the executive parking lot. The kind of German engineering that announces wealth without needing to advertise it. Every employee in that lobby seemed to sense it at the same moment. Backs straightened. Conversations stopped. The teller beside me actually gasped softly. The front door opened and Charles Montgomery walked into his bank. He was 80 years old, leaning on a cane carved from African blackwood that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. But age hadn't diminished him the way it had Eleanor. He still moved with the certainty of someone who'd never been told no, who'd spent 8 decades bending the world to his will. His suit was impeccable. His silver hair was perfectly styled. And when his eyes found me across that lobby, I saw something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not surprise. Recognition. He knew exactly who I was, and he'd been expecting this moment for 25 years. Charles Montgomery stood in the entrance of Riverside Community Bank like he owned it, which in many ways he did. Not legally. The bank was a publicly traded regional institution, but through decades of influence, strategic relationships, and the kind of power that comes from controlling $4.5 billion in assets. Every employee in that lobby knew who he was. More importantly, they knew what crossing him could cost. But what Charles didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the legal documents I'd just filed had already triggered protocols that were beyond even his considerable reach. I heard the commotion before I saw its source. Rapid footsteps from the administrative corridor, the sound of someone moving with urgent purpose. A man in his 50s burst through the door marked "Staff Only," clutching a tablet and looking like he'd just been informed of a bomb threat. Thomas Reed, the bank's compliance officer, a position that usually involved reviewing loan applications and ensuring proper documentation. Today, his job had become considerably more complicated. "Everyone, please listen," Thomas announced, his voice cracking slightly with stress. "We have a legal preservation order in effect as of this morning. All staff members with access to trust accounts need to follow emergency protocol immediately." I watched the confusion ripple through the lobby. The tellers looked at each other uncertainly. Victoria, still standing near her office, had gone from white to a sickly green. And Charles across the room remained perfectly still, his face betraying nothing. Thomas was reading from a printed checklist, ticking off items as he spoke. All terminals with trust account access must be logged and locked. No modifications to any records. Email servers are being backed up to third-party storage as we speak. Security footage from the past 30 days is being duplicated and sent to court-appointed custodians. "This is absurd." Victoria finally found her voice. "Thomas, this is a family matter. Surely we can—" "This is federal law, Ms. Parker." Thomas interrupted, and I saw him flinch at his own boldness in cutting off his supervisor. "A preservation order means we treat this facility as a potential crime scene. Any deviation from protocol could result in criminal charges for obstruction of justice." The word crime hung in the air like smoke. Mrs. Patricia Hendricks, still standing near the new accounts desk, nodded with grim satisfaction. The businessman who'd been watching earlier pulled out his phone, probably texting his friends about the drama unfolding at Riverside's most prestigious bank. And the young teller who'd been helping me looked like she might cry. Thomas approached Victoria with a document requiring her signature. "I need you to confirm that you understand the preservation order has been implemented and that you will not access, modify, or delete any trust-related records pending the compliance review." Victoria's hand shook so badly she could barely hold the pen. She signed where Thomas pointed, but her eyes kept darting to Charles, looking for guidance, for reassurance, for someone to tell her this was all a mistake that could be fixed. Charles offered her nothing. He simply watched, his expression as neutral as a statue. "Ms. Parker," Victoria said, turning to me with something that looked almost like desperation. "Rachel, can we please step into a private office and discuss this like adults, like family?" I'd been expecting this. Margaret had warned me that Charles would try to isolate me, to have conversations off the record where threats could be made and later denied. The key was staying visible, staying documented, staying in spaces where cameras and witnesses could protect me. "This isn't a family discussion, Victoria. I said clearly, making sure my voice carried to everyone in the lobby. "This is a legal proceeding. Everything said in a private room could be construed as witness tampering. I prefer public spaces with cameras." The implication was surgical and precise. I wasn't just accusing the trust of financial mismanagement. I was already treating this like a criminal investigation, already thinking about evidence and testimony, and the legal frameworks that would protect me when Charles tried to destroy my credibility, the way he'd destroyed Eleanor's in 2005. Victoria's face showed she understood exactly what I was saying. Her sister, the invisible one, the dismissed one, the one who'd run away to California, had come back as someone who knew how to fight in ways Victoria had never imagined. Thomas appeared again, this time with more paperwork. "Ms. Parker, I need your signature here confirming you're aware that customers requiring routine banking services are being redirected to our Millbrook branch while we implement the preservation protocols." Victoria signed again, mechanical, now her professional world collapsing around her in real time. I noticed movement in the administrative corridor. Douglas Whitmore, the bank president, was on the phone in his office. The walls were glass designed to project transparency and openness, which meant I could see his expression clearly. He looked like a man who'd just been given a terminal diagnosis. The call lasted 30 minutes. I knew because I timed it standing calmly at the counter, while the bank's emergency procedures played out around me. Customers were politely redirected. Staff members whispered in clusters, trying to understand what was happening. Thomas worked through his checklist with bureaucratic precision, and Charles Montgomery stood in the same spot he'd occupied since entering, watching everything with the patience of a predator who'd waited 25 years and could wait a little longer. When Douglas Whitmore finally emerged from his office, his usual confident stride had been replaced by the careful steps of someone walking on ice. He approached me with the kind of exaggerated politeness people use when they're terrified of saying the wrong thing. "Ms. Parker," he said, and I noticed the formality, not Rachel, not Miss Parker, but the safe professional distance of someone covering himself legally. "I've just spoken with our regional trust management office. They've confirmed your standing as a beneficiary of the Eleanor Parker Trust and your right to request accounting under Massachusetts law." "I'm aware," I said mildly. "They'll be sending a trust compliance team tomorrow morning to begin the accounting process. This is..." He paused, searching for words, "highly unusual." I offered him a small smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "Unusual suggests it doesn't happen often, Mr. Whitmore. I'd argue it doesn't happen often enough. How many elderly clients have requested full accountings of their trusts in the past decade?" He opened his mouth, then closed it clearly, doing the mental calculation and realizing the answer was probably 0. "Exactly," I said softly. Which raises the question, why don't beneficiaries ask for transparency? Is it because they trust the system, or because they've been taught that asking questions is inappropriate? Before Whitmore could formulate a response, Charles Montgomery finally moved. He crossed the lobby with the slow, deliberate gait of someone who'd never had to hurry for anything in his life. His cane tapped against the marble floor with rhythmic precision. He didn't acknowledge. Victoria didn't glance at the staff members who straightened automatically as he passed, didn't spare even a moment for Douglas Whitmore. His entire focus was on me. When he stood 3 feet away, I could smell his cologne, expensive, understated, the kind of scent that whispered wealth rather than shouted it. His eyes, still sharp despite his 80 years, studied my face with an intensity that felt like being dissected. "I knew your father very well, Rachel." His voice was quiet, cultured, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Brilliant young man, idealistic, convinced he was fighting for justice." He paused, and the silence stretched between us like a wire pulled taut. "Do you know what idealism gets you in the real world?" His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I do. I buried it 25 years ago." The threat wasn't in his words exactly, though "I buried it 25 years ago" was clear enough. The threat was in how comfortable Charles looked saying it, standing in the middle of a bank lobby with security cameras recording and witnesses watching. He wasn't worried about being overheard. He wasn't concerned about evidence. After 8 decades of making problems disappear, he'd apparently stopped believing consequences could touch him. I held his gaze, forcing myself not to look away, not to show the fear that was coiling in my stomach. "My father believed in accountability," I said quietly. "I do too." Charles's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Reassessment, maybe, or the faint surprise of someone who'd expected an easier opponent. He'd probably assumed I'd be like Eleanor, capable of one burst of courage, followed by 25 years of silence. He was about to learn otherwise. "Perhaps we could discuss this more productively in private," he said, gesturing toward the bank's conference room with his cane. The movement was graceful despite his age, the African blackwood gleaming under the lobby's recessed lighting. "Away from unnecessary spectacle. I'm sure we can resolve this misunderstanding without disrupting the entire bank's operations." It was framed as a courtesy almost grandfatherly in its tone. But everyone in that lobby understood it was a command. When Charles Montgomery suggested something people in Riverside didn't refuse, they nodded, smiled, and did exactly what he wanted. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Montgomery," I said, keeping my voice level and clear. "But I'm comfortable here." The silence that followed was profound. Thomas Reed, still clutching his compliance checklist, actually took a step backward. Douglas Whitmore's eyes went wide. Even Mrs. Patricia Hendricks, who'd been enjoying the drama, looked momentarily shocked that I'd refused the town's patriarch so directly. Charles's smile didn't waver, but I saw his hand tighten slightly on the cane's handle. He pivoted smoothly, turning the refusal into an opportunity to perform for the assembled audience. "I understand you've been away from Riverside for some time, Rachel," he said, his voice carrying that perfect blend of disappointment and concern that made you feel like you'd let down a beloved grandparent. 7 years in California, isn't it? Perhaps you've forgotten how things work in a community like ours. He took a step closer, and I forced myself to hold my ground. "We handle family matters with discretion," he continued, emphasizing each word carefully. "With respect for legacy, with consideration for the people who might be hurt by—" He paused as if searching for the right word, though I suspected he'd rehearsed this speech the moment Victoria called him. "Unnecessary publicity. Your great-aunt Eleanor, for instance. A dying woman who deserves peace in her final months, not the stress of legal battles and public scrutiny." It was masterful manipulation. He was framing my pursuit of justice as an attack on Eleanor, making me the villain in a story where I was trying to protect her. And he was doing it in front of witnesses who would remember his reasonable concern versus my stubborn refusal to compromise. "The Eleanor Parker Trust has served this community for 75 years, Charles said, warming to his theme. "The senior center that bears our family name provides health care to 300 elderly residents daily. The scholarship program has sent 42 students to college. The Arts Foundation supports programs for underprivileged children. These aren't just numbers on a balance sheet, Rachel. These are real people whose lives depend on the stability and reputation of the trust." The implication was devastatingly clear. If I continued this fight, I wouldn't just be attacking Charles Montgomery. I'd be attacking every institution he'd built, every person who benefited from his philanthropy, every corner of Riverside's social structure that he'd spent 50 years cultivating. I'd be the outsider who came back to tear down everything good and decent about this community. It would have been effective if I still cared what Riverside thought of me. If I hadn't spent 7 years building a life that required nothing from this town or its opinion. If I hadn't learned that reputation often protects the guilty while silencing the victims. Before I could respond, the bank's front door opened and Margaret Chen strode in with the purposeful efficiency of an attorney who'd timed her entrance perfectly. Her briefcase snapped open with a sharp click that drew everyone's attention. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, pulling out a thick folder bound with a blue legal backing. "As trustee of the Eleanor Parker Trust, you're being formally served with a petition for complete accounting under Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 203E, Section 813. You have 30 days to provide comprehensive financial records, including but not limited to all distributions made in the past 10 years. All investment decisions, all fees charged, all loans issued, and all charitable expenditures claimed. She handed him the folder with both hands, the formal service of legal documents. Charles took it, and for the first time I saw genuine emotion flicker across his face. Not anger exactly, but something sharper. Annoyance, perhaps, at being challenged so publicly, or concern that the machinery of law was grinding into motion despite his considerable influence. "Margaret," he said, his voice cooling several degrees. "I'm disappointed. Eleanor has been your client for 15 years now. You've attended family gatherings. We've worked together on charitable initiatives. And now you're participating in this." He stopped, the unfinished sentence hanging like an accusation. Margaret's expression didn't change. "I'm participating in my fiduciary duty as an attorney representing a client whose trust has displayed irregularities warranting investigation. My personal relationship with the family is irrelevant to my professional obligations." Charles's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then he turned back to me, and his voice took on a quality I hadn't heard before, something harder beneath the cultured politeness. "Your father made similar accusations once," he said quietly. 25 years ago, David stood exactly where you're standing now, convinced he was protecting the family from my alleged mismanagement. He believed he was fighting for justice, for accountability, for all those noble ideals they teach in law school. He took a step closer, and I smelled that expensive cologne again, mingled now with something that might have been threat, or might have been memory. He was passionate, certain, absolutely convinced he was right. Charles's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "It didn't end well for him. I hope you'll learn from his mistakes, Rachel. I truly do." The words landed like a physical blow. He was admitting it right here in front of everyone that my father's death wasn't an accident, or at least he was admitting enough to make sure I understood the danger I was in. Charles turned toward the door, his cane tapping against the marble with that same rhythmic precision. Victoria stood frozen near her office, looking like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Douglas Whitmore had retreated to a safe distance. Thomas Reed was staring at his tablet like it might provide escape from this situation. Then Charles paused one hand on the door handle and looked back at me with an expression that might have been grandfatherly concern if I didn't know better. "Oh, and Rachel," he said, his tone shifting to something almost casual, almost warm. "Happy early birthday. 25 is such an important age, isn't it? The age when trust beneficiaries gain full access to their inheritance. I do hope you make it there." The temperature in the lobby seemed to drop 10 degrees. Victoria went white, her hand flying to her mouth. She understood what I was just beginning to process, that her grandfather had just threatened my life in a room full of witnesses and cameras, and he was confident enough to believe it didn't matter. That power and influence and 50 years of untouchability had convinced him he could say anything, do anything, and face no consequences. Margaret's hand gripped my arm tight enough to hurt, and Diana, my investigator who'd been standing quietly near the ATM machines, pulled out her phone and started recording everything. Charles's threat hung over me for the rest of that day and through a sleepless night in my hotel room. Diana wanted to file for a restraining order immediately. Margaret argued that Charles's words, while menacing, were too ambiguous to prove specific intent. Robert suggested we focus on the financial evidence and let the criminal investigation handle threats. But all I could think about was my father, 28 years old, convinced he was protected by law and righteousness, dead within 36 hours of confronting the same man who'd just told me he hoped I made it to my 25th birthday. The next morning, the trust compliance team arrived at Riverside Community Bank at precisely 8 a.m. I watched from across the street as they unloaded equipment from an unmarked van, 3 auditors who moved with the mechanical efficiency of people who'd conducted investigations like this 100 times before. No badges, no fanfare, just laptops, portable scanners, and the kind of professional detachment that comes from seeing every variety of financial crime humanity can devise. By 9 a.m., they'd commandeered the largest conference room and begun the systematic destruction of Charles Montgomery's carefully constructed fortress. I wasn't allowed in the bank during the active investigation. Margaret explained that my presence could compromise the audit's independence, but Diana had connections with one of the junior auditors, someone who owed her a favor from a previous case. Updates came in throughout the day via encrypted messages that painted a picture of institutional panic setting in like fog. The requests started simply: transaction records for the past decade, board meeting minutes, investment reports. But each request spawned 10 more, as auditors followed trails through the financial maze Charles had built. Where did this wire transfer originate? Who approved this distribution? Why was this fee structure changed in 2018? Every answer revealed another question, another inconsistency, another thread that needed pulling. The preservation order meant everything was tracked. Every email sent by bank staff was logged and copied to third-party servers. Every document accessed left a digital fingerprint. Every file printed was cataloged. For employees accustomed to handling trust business with what they called discretion, which Margaret translated as minimal documentation and maximum flexibility, this level of scrutiny was suffocating. By 11 a.m., Senior Auditor Jennifer Walsh requested an interview with Victoria Parker. Diana's contact forwarded me a summary that evening, and I read it 3 times, each time feeling a complex mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. Satisfaction that the trap was working, unease at watching my sister realize she'd been used, and something darker that I didn't want to examine too closely, a small vindictive part of me that wanted Victoria to suffer the way she'd made me suffer. Jennifer Walsh had spread 4 loan approval documents across the conference room table. Each one bore Victoria's signature in blue ink, crisp and official. Each one was dated 2019, August, September, October, November. 4 consecutive months, 4 massive loans totaling $80 million, all approved by Victoria Parker Trust Operations Manager. Except Victoria didn't join the trust department until March 2020, and she didn't receive signatory authority until her promotion in 2021. According to Diana's source, Victoria stared at the documents for a full minute before speaking. "These aren't my signatures," she'd said, her voice barely above a whisper. Then she'd looked closer, and her face had gone white. "Or rather they are. That's definitely my signature. But I never signed these specific documents. I couldn't have. I wasn't even working at this bank in 2019. Jennifer Walsh, who'd apparently seen this moment of realization dozens of times in her career, had simply waited. Someone must have... Victoria had stopped the full implications crashing down. Either someone had forged her signature using a stamp or a digital copy taken from legitimate documents she'd signed later, or the loan documents had been backdated after she received authority using her real signatures but falsifying the dates. Either way, Victoria was sitting at the center of $80 million in fraudulent loans, and every piece of paper said she'd approved them. The person with access to create such sophisticated forgeries, who could backdate documents, who had the technical capability and authority to manipulate records: Charles Montgomery. The man who'd hired Victoria trained her, told her she was special, and apparently positioned her to take the fall if his scheme ever came to light. Diana's source said Victoria had started crying in that conference room, not the performative tears of someone trying to manipulate sympathy, but the genuine breakdown of someone whose entire understanding of reality had just shattered. The panic spread through the bank like a virus. By afternoon, junior staff members were discovering their names in email chains, approving questionable transfers. Administrative assistants found they'd processed wire transfers flagged as suspicious. Even Douglas Whitmore realized his signature appeared on documents he didn't remember seeing. The bank's legal counsel sent out a memo that evening advising all employees involved in trust operations to retain personal legal representation. The message was clear: you're on your own. Whitmore received a call from regional headquarters that lasted 90 minutes. Diana managed to get a partial transcript through sources I didn't want to know about. The gist: the parent company was considering whether Riverside Community Bank had adequate oversight structures, whether management had been negligent, and whether the entire branch might need to be restructured or even closed pending the investigation's outcome. Whitmore emerged from that call looking like he'd aged 2 decades. I was reviewing Diana's updates in my hotel room that evening, trying to decide whether I felt guilty about the collateral damage we were causing to people who might be innocent, when there was a soft knock at my door. I looked through the peephole and saw a young Asian woman in her mid-20s looking nervously up and down the hallway. She didn't look threatening, but Charles had proven he could use anyone. "Who is it?" I called through the door. "My name is Sarah Chen. I work in the trust department. I need to talk to you, please." I opened the door with the chain still attached. "How did you find my hotel?" "I followed you from the bank yesterday. I'm sorry. I know that sounds creepy, but I couldn't approach you there and I didn't have your number and I need—" She stopped, taking a shaky breath. "I need you to know something, but I can't be seen talking to you." I studied her face through the gap. Fear, yes, but also something else. Determination. The look of someone who'd made a difficult choice and was forcing herself to follow through. "Wait here," I said. I texted Diana and Margaret, "Potential contact at hotel, Sarah Chen Trust Dept, recording everything." Then I opened the door. Sarah slipped inside, glanced around like she expected armed guards, and then pulled a folded piece of paper from her coat pocket. She pressed it into my hand and turned to leave. "Wait," I said. "What is this?" "I can't talk now. Too dangerous. But you need to know there's a second set of books. Physical files in Charles's private office at the bank. Documents that don't exist in the digital system. I can get you in, but only once. And only if you promise to protect me when this all comes out." She was at the door before I could respond. "How do I contact you?" I called. "You don't. I'll contact you." And she was gone. I unfolded the note, a single line in handwriting that trembled with fear or adrenaline or both. "There's a second set of books, physical files in Charles's private office. I can get you in, but only once, and only if you promise to protect me." It was signed, "Someone who's tired of being complicit." I immediately called Margaret and Diana. They arrived within 20 minutes, and I showed them the note and recounted the conversation. Diana was already running a background check on her laptop. Sarah Chen, 26, employed at Riverside Community Bank for 4 years, degree in finance from UMass, no criminal record, no red flags, student loans totaling $180,000. She's drowning in debt. "Which makes her vulnerable," Margaret observed. "Perfect for Charles to control through fear of losing her job." "Or perfect for us," Diana countered. "Desperate enough to risk everything for the right incentive." "Or both," I said quietly. "Charles would know exactly which employees are desperate enough to flip and which ones he can manipulate through fear. This could be a genuine whistleblower or an elaborate trap." Robert suggested bringing Sarah in for a recorded interview establishing her credibility before we trusted her information. Before we could decide on next steps, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I showed the screen to Diana, who nodded and started recording. The text was brief. "The office. Tonight, 2 a.m. Alone. Or I disappear." No signature. No explanation. But I recognized desperation when I saw it. Against every instinct screaming at me not to meet a stranger alone in the middle of the night at a bank where my grandfather had just threatened my life, I found myself pulling into Riverside Community Bank's empty parking lot at 1:45 a.m. Diana had insisted on positioning herself in a car across the street with a clear line of sight. Margaret had made me promise to keep my phone on speaker mode in my pocket, recording everything. Robert had simply said, "This is either the break we need or a trap. Either way, we'll know soon." The December cold bit through my coat as I stepped out of my rental car. My breath formed white clouds in the streetlight glow, and I counted 4 security cameras covering the lot. If this was a setup, at least, it would be documented. Sarah Chen emerged from the shadows near the bank's side entrance at precisely 2 a.m. She was small, maybe 5'3", bundled in a puffy winter coat that made her look even younger than 26. But it was her eyes that struck me wide with fear, darting constantly between my car, the street, the bank's windows, like a rabbit expecting predators from every direction. "You came alone," she whispered, even though we were the only two people visible for blocks. "My team knows I'm here," I said, which wasn't quite a lie. "Are you okay? You look terrified." "I am terrified," she said bluntly, her voice shaking. "I've worked at this bank for 4 years. I've seen things, processed things, helped with things I knew weren't right. And I never said anything because I need this job. I have $180,000 in student loans. My parents are getting older. They depend on me financially. Refusing Charles Montgomery's instructions isn't an option when you're drowning in debt and every other job in this town pays half what the bank does." I recognized the tone confession mixed with justification, guilt mixed with survival instinct. I'd heard it dozens of times in my work with Elder Advocacy Network, from caregivers who'd skimmed money from clients' accounts, from family members who'd forged signatures on documents they knew were wrong. Economic desperation doesn't excuse crime, but it explains how good people become complicit in bad systems. "Why are you coming forward now?" I asked. Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Because Victoria's interview yesterday. I watched her realize she'd been set up, that all those signatures on documents from before she even worked here were going to destroy her. And I thought, how long until they realize I processed transfers I shouldn't have? How long until my name ends up on the wrong document, and I'm the one crying in a conference room while auditors decide whether to recommend criminal charges?" She pulled out her access card, the plastic catching the streetlight. "Charles keeps 2 sets of records. Everyone knows it, but we don't talk about it. The digital system has the official version, clean auditable, designed to pass regulatory review. But there's also physical files he maintains separately. Documents with original signatures, FE schedules that don't match the official book's correspondence with borrowers who don't exist in the main database." "Where?" I asked. "Basement storage. I have access because I filed documents for the trust department. Come on, we don't have much time. Security patrol comes through at 2:30. Sarah led me to the side entrance, swiped her card, and held the door open. The bank's interior was dark except for emergency lighting casting everything in eerie red-tinted shadows. We moved quickly through the lobby where I'd confronted Victoria just a week ago, past the conference room where auditors were systematically dismantling Charles's empire, and down a stairwell I hadn't known existed. The basement was exactly what you'd expect from a century-old building: low ceilings, exposed pipes, the smell of old paper and concrete. Sarah navigated confidently through the maze of storage until we reached a locked door marked Trust Department Archives, Restricted Access. Her hands shook as she unlocked it. Inside were filing cabinets, dozens of them, organized with a meticulousness that suggested frequent use rather than long-term storage. Sarah went directly to one labeled Community Development 2019 to 2023 and pulled out a thick folder. "This is what you need to see," she said, spreading documents across a dusty table. Loan agreements, 8 of them totaling exactly $80 million distributed across 4 entities. Riverside Development Partners, New England Community Fund, Senior Care Initiatives LLC, and Parker Legacy Foundation. Each agreement listed its purpose as senior housing development with detailed descriptions of projects that sounded legitimate: affordable assisted living facilities, memory care units, renovation of existing nursing homes. But Robert's research had found no record of these projects ever being built. The money had been borrowed from the trust, but the developments didn't exist. "Where did the money actually go?" I asked, photographing each page. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "That's above my clearance level. I just processed the transfers when Charles authorized them." I was methodically working through the folder when I found something that made my blood turn to ice. A loan application on official trust letterhead dated April 2018. Amount $2.5 million. Borrower name Rachel Parker. I stared at my own name at the signature that looked exactly like mine, the distinctive way I looped the R, the sharp angle of my P, the slight leftward slant I'd developed in college. But I'd never seen this document before. I'd never applied for this loan. In April 2018, I was living in San Francisco working at Elder Advocacy Network with no connection to the Eleanor Parker Trust beyond being a distant, forgotten beneficiary. "Sarah," I said carefully, "do you remember processing this?" She looked at the document and frowned. "That was before my time, but I've seen the file referenced. Charles mentioned it once when explaining why increased oversight was necessary. Said you'd taken a loan for personal investments that went bad. He used it as an example of why beneficiary requests needed careful review. The purpose of the loan was listed as personal investment opportunity, and the approval signature Charles Montgomery dated 2 days after the application. The forgery was sophisticated. Someone had studied my handwriting extensively, probably from documents I'd submitted to the bank years ago, account applications, signature cards from when I'd first opened my checking account. They'd created a composite signature that would pass casual inspection. This was why Charles had added me to the trust after my father's death. Not out of generosity or family obligation, but to create a scapegoat. If the fraud was ever discovered, he had documentation showing I'd been stealing from the trust for years. He'd built my guilt before I even knew I was a suspect. "We need to photograph everything," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the rage building in my chest. Sarah kept watch at the door while I worked my phone camera, clicking through page after page of evidence. Loan agreements, fee schedules showing the real percentages Charles charged versus what was reported to regulators. Correspondence with borrowers using addresses that didn't exist. I was almost finished when Sarah's phone buzzed. She pulled it out, read the message, and went absolutely white. "It's from Victoria," she whispered. "She knows I'm here. She's asking me to come to her office right now." My mind raced through possibilities. Victoria could be trying to stop us, could be calling security, could be alerting Charles. Or this could be something else entirely. Then my own phone buzzed, Victoria's number. But the message wasn't a threat. "Sarah isn't the only one who's tired of this. We need to talk, not as sisters, as two people who've both been used." An attachment loaded a photo of Charles's study documents scattered across his desk. I zoomed in and felt my stomach drop. The documents bore Victoria's signature, but the dates were impossible. 1999, 2000. Years before Victoria was even born, let alone working at the bank. A second text arrived. "I didn't know. I swear to God, Rachel. I didn't know what he was doing." Victoria's text message changed everything. If she truly hadn't known about the forgeries, if she'd been used the same way I had, then this wasn't a simple story of sibling rivalry or family greed. This was something darker. A grandfather who'd systematically weaponized his own granddaughters to protect himself from consequences. I wanted to respond to Victoria immediately, but Sarah was still standing at the storage room door, terrified and exposed. "First things first. We need to get you out of here safely," I told Sarah. "If Victoria knows you're helping me, Charles will know within hours." Sarah nodded, her face pale. "I kept copies of everything I gave you. If something happens to me, they're with my attorney. Not that I think it'll matter. People like Charles Montgomery don't leave loose ends." The casual way she said it, the acceptance that helping me might cost her life, made my chest tighten. This was what Charles had built over decades, a system where vulnerable people understood that resistance meant destruction, so they stayed silent, even when they witnessed crimes. "Nothing's going to happen to you," I said with more confidence than I felt. "You're a federal witness now. That comes with protections." We left through different exits. I watched Sarah disappear into the pre-dawn darkness, hoping I hadn't just signed her death warrant by accepting her help. By the time I got back to my hotel, it was nearly 4 a.m. I managed 2 hours of fitful sleep before my phone started buzzing with messages from my team. Margaret had scheduled an emergency meeting for 6 p.m. on Christmas Eve. The irony wasn't lost on any of us, the season of family togetherness, and we'd be spending it gathered around evidence of familial betrayal, Robert arrived at Margaret's office first, carrying his laptop and a portable scanner he'd borrowed from a colleague at a forensics lab. Diana came with 3 portable hard drives containing encrypted backups of everything we'd collected. Margaret had ordered enough Chinese takeout to feed an army apparently operating on the assumption that we'd be there well into the night. She was right. Robert began with the loan document bearing my forged signature. He pulled up the apartment lease I'd signed in San Francisco in April 2018, my employment contract with Elder Advocacy Network from the same month, and my California driver's license application. Then he put them side by side with the trust loan application and began his analysis. "The forgery is very sophisticated," he said, pointing to microscopic details on his screen. "Look at the pen pressure patterns, the letters spacing the overall flow. To the naked eye, these signatures are identical. Even a handwriting expert might be fooled on first glance." "But," Margaret prompted, "but when you examine them under magnification and compare the stroke patterns you can see, this isn't a natural signature." Robert zoomed in on the R in Rachel. "This signature was created digitally. Someone scanned your real signatures from multiple documents, probably your initial bank account applications, maybe your college records if Charles had access to them, and used software to create a composite. They mapped the pressure points, the angles, the timing of each stroke. Then they could reproduce this signature infinitely, either printing it directly onto documents or using a signature stamp." Diana leaned forward. "That requires expensive software and technical expertise. This isn't something a random employee could do." "Exactly," Robert agreed. "This is professional-grade document fraud. And here's what makes it damning: the loan application is dated April 2018. But Rachel's handwriting evolved slightly between her college years and 2018. The forged signature uses characteristics from documents she signed in 2016 and 2017, creating a composite that wouldn't have existed naturally in April 2018. It's like creating a person's face by combining their features from different years. It looks right, until you realize the timeline doesn't work." Margaret was already taking notes. "That's timeline impossibility. Impossible to defend against." "It gets better," Robert said, pulling up the $80 million in community development loans. "If they forged Rachel's signature, what about these?" He began examining each loan document systematically, comparing signatures against known samples. "This loan from 2019 bears the signature of Harold Freeman, former trust board member. Except Harold has Parkinson's disease and his signature showed tremors by 2019. This signature is too steady. This one from 2020 claims approval from Catherine Walsh, trust attorney. But Catherine died in a car accident in 2018, and this loan..." He stopped, his expression hardening. "This $15 million approval supposedly bears Eleanor Parker's signature from 2017. Eleanor, can you look at this?" Eleanor had joined us remotely via video call, too weak to travel, but insistent on being present. From her hospital bed, she studied the signature on Robert's screen. "That's not how I sign my name," she said quietly. "The E is wrong. I always loop it twice. This only loops once. Someone studied my signature but didn't quite get the details right." Robert nodded grimly. "Charles has been doing this for years, creating a paper trail of collective guilt, spreading forged signatures across enough people that if fraud was discovered, blame would be so diffused that prosecution would be nearly impossible. Who do you charge when 20 different people supposedly approved questionable transactions, especially when half of them are retired dead or suffering from conditions that make them unreliable witnesses?" "But he made a mistake," I said, seeing the pattern. "He forged my signature before I had any reason to be involved with the trust. He created evidence of my guilt before I even knew I was supposed to be guilty." "Which makes it provable fraud," Margaret confirmed. "We don't need to prove Charles's intent or establish his state of mind. We just need to show that a document exists with your signature authorizing a loan you never applied for, dated when you were across the country with no involvement in trust business. Timeline impossibility. It's the cleanest evidence in a fraud case." She was already drafting as we spoke, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "I'm filing an emergency motion with probate court first thing after Christmas. We're requesting immediate appointment of an independent trustee removal of Charles Montgomery for cause and referral to the FBI for criminal investigation. Wire fraud, forgery, elder abuse. Once it's federal, Charles can't use his local connections to make it disappear." Diana pulled up the federal statute on her laptop. "Using digital systems to create forged documents across state lines, that's federal wire fraud. Mandatory minimum sentencing if convicted. And it's not something a good lawyer can plea bargain down easily. The evidence is too clean." We worked through the night building the case with the kind of methodical precision that turns suspicion into prosecution. By midnight, Margaret had drafted a 60-page emergency motion supported by Robert's forensic analysis, Diana's investigative timeline, and sworn affidavits from Eleanor and me. It was airtight. It was devastating, and it would transform this from a family dispute into a federal criminal investigation. We were celebrating our breakthrough with cold Chinese food and exhausted optimism when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Rachel, it's your mother." Anna's voice hit me like cold water. 7 years since I'd heard it, and it still had the power to make me feel 12 years old and unwanted. "Please come home," she said, and I heard her voice crack. "Tonight. Your grandfather wants to explain everything. He's prepared to make this right, but he needs to speak with you privately." "Tell him to explain it to the FBI," I said. "They'll be very interested in his explanations." "Rachel, please." She was crying now. "He's an old man, 80 years old. This stress could kill him. Just one conversation. For me, for the family you walked away from." The emotional manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting. But before I could hang up, she added something that stopped me cold. "I signed those documents too, Rachel. The loan in your name. Charles told me it was to protect you from taxes. I believed him." A pause. Or maybe I just needed to believe him. Either way, I'm guilty too. And if you push this, I go to prison alongside him. My mother's admission that she'd helped frame me should have made refusing her meeting easy. But the crack in her voice when she said, "I'm guilty too," planted a seed of doubt I couldn't quite shake. Was this manipulation, or was she finally telling the truth? Margaret advised against meeting her at all. Diana said it was almost certainly a trap. But Eleanor from her hospital bed said something that changed my mind. "Your mother has been Charles's prisoner longer than any of us. If she's finally ready to break free, we need to let her." So on January 2nd, I found myself back in Eleanor's sunroom, the space where this entire nightmare had started barely a month ago. Eleanor was there in her wheelchair, weaker than I'd ever seen her, but insistent on witnessing this. Margaret sat in the corner with her laptop open, ready to document everything. And Anna Parker, my mother's stranger accomplice, sat across from me, looking like she'd aged a decade in the 7 years since I'd seen her. Her designer coat couldn't hide the woman underneath, who'd stopped sleeping, stopped pretending, stopped holding together the facade of the perfect riverside wife. When she spoke, her voice was flat, emptied of everything except exhausted truth. "I forged your signature, Rachel. Not all of them, but some. Charles would bring me documents, tell me they were estate planning tools to protect you from inheritance taxes. Tax shelters, he called them. Legal structures wealthy families used all the time, and I'd practice your handwriting until I could reproduce it perfectly." The words hit me like physical blows. Not just complicit, not just passively allowing Charles's schemes. My mother had actively, deliberately participated in framing me. "Why?" The word came out hoarse. Anna took a shaky breath. "I need you to understand how this started. When your father died, I was 26 years old, 7 months pregnant with you and terrified. 3 days after David's funeral, Charles came to me with documentation, emails supposedly from David bank statements showing offshore accounts, evidence that made it look like he'd been planning to embezzle from the trust. It was all fake, I know that now, but then I was grieving exhausted and Charles was so convincing. He said he'd keep it quiet, let David be remembered as a hero instead of a thief, but only if I cooperated. Cooperated how? I asked, though I already knew. Marry James within 8 weeks. Give you a father. Make the family look stable and whole so no one would dig deeper into David's death. She looked at Eleanor. He threatened you too, didn't he? Said if I didn't do what he wanted, he'd destroy Eleanor's legal career by claiming she was David's accomplice. Eleanor nodded slowly, confirming a secret she'd kept for 25 years. Anna continued, her voice hollow. So I married my dead husband's brother and spent 25 years convincing myself I'd made the right choice. I told myself I was protecting you by giving you legitimacy, by signing papers Charles claimed would shelter you from taxes. I let Victoria grow up thinking she was the favored child because it was easier than explaining I was raising one child while mourning the father I actually loved. I became an expert at justification, at survival, at choosing comfort over truth. But you knew, I said quietly. You knew Charles killed my father. I knew, she whispered. Maybe not with absolute certainty, but enough. And I married into his family anyway. I chose survival over justice. And then I raised you in a house where your father's murderer controlled everything. Your education, your opportunities, even whether you deserved to be acknowledged at the dinner table. She finally met my eyes, and I saw something I'd never seen before, genuine shame. I don't expect forgiveness, Rachel. I'm not asking for it. I'm just asking you to understand why I became what I became. I sat in silence, processing layers of betrayal so deep, I couldn't find the bottom. Finally, I forced myself to ask the question that mattered most. Did you know about the loan in my name? The $2.5 million? Anna nodded. I signed it. Charles said it was a tax shelter, that we were protecting your future inheritance. By the time I realized it was fraud, you were already gone, already safe in California. I thought if I kept you away from Riverside, kept you out of Charles's reach, you'd be protected from whatever he was planning. I stood needing to leave before I said something I'd regret. But before I reached the door, Anna spoke again. He's scared of you, Rachel. I've never seen Charles scared of anyone in 50 years. But you're David's daughter, and you have something David didn't have when he fought Charles. I turned. What's that? Her smile was bitter, broken, but real. You have me, and I'm finally ready to testify. My mother's offer to testify changed everything. Within 48 hours, Margaret had negotiated an immunity agreement with federal prosecutors. Anna would provide complete, truthful testimony about her role in the forgery scheme and everything she knew about Charles's operations, and in exchange she wouldn't face criminal charges. It was a deal that made my stomach turn, but Margaret was pragmatic. We need her testimony more than we need her in prison, and juries are more sympathetic to coerced accomplices than to masterminds. The interviews took place over 3 days in a secure conference room at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston. I wasn't allowed to be present witness contamination concerns, but Margaret shared the transcripts with me each evening, and what emerged was a picture of corruption so vast and so carefully constructed that it took my breath away. Charles hadn't just embezzled from the trust. He'd turned it into a private bank for Riverside's elite, using the $4.5 billion in assets to issue loans at rates so favorable they were essentially gifts. The doctor who'd provided the psychiatric evaluation declaring Eleanor mentally incompetent in 2005, he'd borrowed $3 million at 1% interest to expand his practice. The police chief who'd buried Eleanor's witness statement about seeing Charles near David's car. His son received a $500,000 scholarship from a trust-funded educational foundation. The bank president, the mayor, the probate court judge who'd initially dismissed Eleanor's concerns. All of them had connections to loans, donations, or favors that traced back to Charles Montgomery. It was a network of complicity so extensive that exposing Charles meant threatening half of Riverside's power structure. Everyone had something to lose. Everyone had a reason to protect him. And for 25 years that protection had been absolute. But the darkest revelation came on the second day of Anna's testimony, when the prosecutor asked about the night before David's death. Anna had told police in 2000 that David was working late, that she'd gone to bed before he came home. It was a lie. The truth, which she'd suppressed for 25 years, was that David had come home around 6 p.m. agitated in a way she'd never seen before. He'd made 2 phone calls from his study. The first to Eleanor, warning her about what he'd found and asking her to keep certain documents safe. The second to someone Anna didn't recognize at the time. She remembered David's words clearly because they'd frightened her. "I need you to hold on to something for me. If anything happens, give it to Eleanor. Only Eleanor." After David died, Anna never mentioned the second call. Charles convinced her it would make David look paranoid, possibly unstable, that it would raise questions about his mental state that could complicate the investigation. But 25 years later, with immunity protecting her and guilt finally overwhelming fear, Anna remembered the recipient's name: Dr. Harrison Webb, Charles's oldest friend and personal physician. Diana found Webb within hours, still living in Riverside, semi-retired, 71 years old. The background check revealed damning connections. Webb had been on the trust's original advisory board, had borrowed $8 million from the trust in 2001 at nearly 0% interest, and had been Charles's doctor since 1995. When Diana approached him at his home, Webb initially refused to talk. But when she mentioned David Parker's name, she said something shifted in his face. Not just fear, something deeper. Guilt that had been festering for a quarter century. "I've been waiting 25 years for someone to ask me about that night," he told Diana through his half-closed door. "I'm 81 years old. I don't want to die with this." But he had conditions: immunity, his own attorney present, and guarantees that Charles couldn't reach him before he gave his statement. The negotiations took 3 days. Webb's attorney was careful, methodical, making sure every detail of the immunity agreement was ironclad. Finally, on January 15th, in a recorded interview with FBI agents Sarah Martinez and Thomas Chen, Dr. Harrison Webb sat down and unburdened himself of 25 years of guilt. Margaret played me the audio that evening in her office. Webb's voice was thin, elderly, but steady. What he said made my blood run cold. "Charles Montgomery asked me to examine David Parker's car 2 days before the accident. March 13th, 2000. He said it was a routine safety check. Father's prerogative, wanted to make sure his son was maintaining the vehicle properly. I didn't think anything of it. I went to David's house that evening, inspected the brake system, found everything in perfect mechanical condition. I even provided Charles a written certification to that effect." Webb paused, and I heard him take a shaky breath on the recording. 2 days later, those same brakes I'd certified as perfect failed catastrophically, and David Parker drove off a bridge. It took me years to understand what Charles had done. He didn't need me to sabotage the car. He needed me to confirm it was in good condition before the accident. That way, when the brakes failed, investigators would assume it was sudden mechanical failure or driver error, not tampering. He used my medical credibility, my reputation as a physician, to create an alibi for murder. Another pause. Then, "I've been an accessory to murder for 25 years, and I can prove it. I kept the certification I gave Charles. I kept my notes from the inspection. And I kept a record of a phone call David made to me the night before he died, asking me to hold on to evidence he'd gathered about the trust. Charles intercepted that evidence before I could give it to Eleanor. I've lived with that knowledge, that guilt, for a quarter of a century. I'm ready to tell the truth now. All of it." Webb's confession hit the FBI like a bomb. Within 72 hours, the case file on David Parker's death was reclassified from closed accident to open homicide investigation. That single word, homicide, changed everything. Financial fraud carries prison time. Yes, but it's negotiable. Plea bargainable, something wealthy defendants manage to survive with good attorneys and better connections. Murder has no statute of limitations. Murder is personal. And murder, when proven, sends 80-year-old patriarchs to die in federal prison regardless of how many hospital wings bear their name. Charles Montgomery's response to this existential threat was characteristically calculated. He didn't panic, didn't start destroying evidence the preservation order made that impossible anyway. He didn't lawyer up aggressively or flee the country. Instead, he did what he'd always done when faced with problems. He made an offer. The manila envelope arrived at my hotel room on January 18th, hand-delivered by a courier who required my signature and photo ID before handing it over. Inside was a letter on thick, expensive stationery from the law offices of Vance & Associates. Martin Vance Charles's attorney had written it with the careful language of someone who understood he was making an offer that would likely be used as evidence. The proposal was simple: $10 million cash tax-free paid immediately into an account of my choosing. In exchange, I would withdraw all accusations against Charles Montgomery, sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, and provide a sworn statement that I'd been mistaken in my initial concerns about trust management. Vance's cover letter emphasized the practical benefits with the smooth reason of a seasoned negotiator. My legal battle could take years. Attorney fees would run into the millions. Outcomes in complex trust litigation were notoriously uncertain. This settlement offered immediate financial security, would allow my family to heal privately, and would preserve my grandfather's legacy of charitable work that benefited thousands of seniors across New England. It was framed as the adult choice, the reasonable choice, the choice someone who wasn't driven by vindictive emotion would make. I called an emergency meeting with my team. Margaret, Robert, and Diana gathered in my hotel room within an hour, and I laid the offer on the table between us. $10 million, Robert said quietly, looking at the number on the page. That's life-changing money for someone in their 20s. It's also admission that they're desperate, Diana countered. Charles doesn't pay $10 million unless he thinks losing will cost him more. Margaret was reading the fine print, her lawyer's mind already picking apart the agreement structure. The NDA is comprehensive, but it can't prevent you from testifying if you're subpoenaed. FBI investigations don't care about private agreements. You could theoretically take the money and still cooperate with federal prosecutors. But doing so would destroy any credibility I have, I said. Defense attorneys would paint me as someone who took a payout and then testified anyway, motivated by greed, not justice. The room fell silent. $10 million sat there on cheap hotel letterhead representing safety security, the ability to never worry about money again. For someone who'd grown up feeling like the family burden, who'd built a life on nonprofit salaries and student loan debt, it was objectively transformative. "What do you want to do?" Margaret asked finally. I thought about my father, 28 years old, who'd turned down whatever offer Charles had made him and ended up dead. I thought about Eleanor, who'd tried to speak up once and been crushed so thoroughly she'd stayed silent for 2 decades. I thought about Victoria, Anna, Sarah, Chen, all the women who'd been used as weapons in Charles's war against accountability. "I want to reject it," I said, in person, on the record, so there's no ambiguity about where I stand. 2 days later, I sat in Martin Vance's downtown Boston office with a court reporter documenting every word. Vance was a distinguished man in his 60s, perfectly tailored, professionally sympathetic. He clearly thought I was making a mistake. "Mr. Vance," I said, and the court reporter's fingers flew across her stenotype. "Please inform Mr. Montgomery that his offer is rejected. Not because it's insufficient, but because I'm not here to be bought. I'm here to ensure that the man who killed my father and framed me for fraud faces consequences." Vance's expression didn't change, but I saw his hand tighten slightly on his pen. "You can tell him that I understand this decision will make me a target, that he'll use every resource, financial, social, legal, to destroy my credibility and paint me as a vindictive opportunist. But I also understand that people like Charles Montgomery only maintain power when good people choose comfort over justice, and I'm not comfortable anymore." I stood to leave, then turned back. "Oh, and for the record, Mr. Vance, my price isn't $10 million. It's the truth, and that's not for sale." The character assassination began exactly 48 hours later, as coordinated and comprehensive as any military campaign. The front-page story in the Riverside Chronicle appeared 2 days after I rejected Charles's settlement offer, and I recognized it immediately for what it was: the opening salvo in a war Charles intended to win not in court, but in public opinion. The headline read, "Trust Fund Dispute or Family Vendetta. Local Heiress's Claims Raise Questions." And the article was a masterclass in character assassination disguised as journalism. I was described as estranged from family for nearly a decade, which was technically true, but ignored why I'd left. Anonymous bank employees suggested I was fabricating claims to gain access to inheritance, which was slander but impossible to disprove when sources remained unnamed. The journalist, whose byline I recognized from award ceremonies funded by Charles's charitable foundations, wrote with the kind of skeptical tone reserved for people who challenge powerful institutions. By the end of the article, readers who'd never met me would conclude I was bitter, greedy, and willing to destroy a beloved community figure for personal gain. The attacks didn't stop with one newspaper article. Over the next 3 weeks, I watched Charles orchestrate the systematic destruction of my reputation with the precision of someone who'd done this before. I was asked to leave the country club where Margaret and I were reviewing legal documents over coffee. "Members only, ma'am," the manager said apologetically, though I'd been sitting there for 20 minutes before someone recognized me and made a phone call. The church where I'd attended services as a child received an anonymous $50,000 donation with a note suggesting they pray for troubled souls who make false accusations against pillars of the community. Former classmates I hadn't spoken to since high school suddenly posted on social media about how I'd always seemed resentful and had issues with authority figures, creating a narrative of my character based on memories they'd probably invented. The Riverside Historical Society, which Charles chaired, released a public statement celebrating my great-great-grandfather's legacy, while noting with sadness that some descendants have chosen to attack rather than honor the family's tradition of service. Every attack was carefully calibrated, never direct enough to be actionable, never specific enough to refute, just a steady drumbeat designed to isolate me from any community support. The isolation worked. Walking through Riverside became an exercise in public shunning. People I'd known since childhood crossed the street to avoid me. Shopkeepers who'd been friendly suddenly had urgent tasks in the back room when I entered. Even my hotel started receiving complaints, noise violations. I hadn't caused allegations of disturbing other guests, anything to make my presence unwelcome. But Charles made a critical miscalculation. He assumed Riverside was still the same town where his word was law, where everyone benefited from his patronage, and no one dared question his authority. He didn't account for the people who'd been hurt by the same system that protected him. Patricia Hendricks, the 74-year-old woman who'd witnessed Victoria's treatment of me at the bank, wrote a letter to the Chronicle's editor that appeared briefly before being pulled from the online edition. But Diana had screenshot it, and within hours it was circulating on social media. "I've watched the Montgomery family control this town for 50 years. When my sister needed help with her trust, she was told to trust the trustee and not ask questions. She died penniless while her trust was drained by fees. Maybe it's time we asked who's really being protected by all this secrecy." A Facebook group formed within days, Riverside Financial Advocacy. Membership reached 200 people in a week, mostly elderly women, adult children of seniors who'd lost money to questionable trust management people who'd been told for years that their concerns were unfounded or inappropriate. Then the emails started arriving. Thomas Garrett, a retired attorney, sent documentation of his mother's trust, $3 million reduced to almost nothing over 10 years through $800,000 in management fees. The trustee who'd overseen that destruction, a board member of one of Charles's charitable foundations, Linda Torres, provided records of her aunt's trust issuing a $2 million loan to an LLC that dissolved 6 months after receiving the money. The trustee who'd approved it, Charles Montgomery himself. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a pattern spanning 20 years involving dozens of families, millions of dollars. My case wasn't unique. It was just the first one with enough resources, enough knowledge, and enough rage to fight back publicly. I was reviewing these new cases with my team on February 15th when my phone rang. Massachusetts General Hospital. My stomach dropped before I even answered. Eleanor had been admitted with complications. The cancer had spread faster than anyone predicted. Doctors were giving her days, maybe a week. I drove to Boston through winter rain that matched my grief, arriving at the hospital to find Eleanor in intensive care, surrounded by machines that beeped and hissed, keeping her alive through sheer technological stubbornness. But when I entered her room, her eyes were clear and focused with the intensity of someone who had something crucial to say before time ran out. "Rachel," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the machines. "I need to tell you something. Something I've never told anyone, not even the FBI." I pulled a chair close, taking her frail hand. The night before David's accident, I didn't just see Charles near the car. I heard him on the phone. He was in the driveway, didn't know I was there. He was giving instructions to someone. I couldn't hear everything, but I heard one sentence clearly: "Make it look natural. No evidence, no questions." My chest tightened. "Eleanor," I convinced myself I misunderstood. She continued, tears streaming down her weathered face. That I was being paranoid that Charles wouldn't actually hurt his own son. But I knew Rachel. Deep down I knew. And I did nothing. I've lived with that cowardice every day for 25 years. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Eleanor's confession hit me like a physical blow. But there was no time to process the emotional weight of what she'd carried for 25 years. The doctors were clear her body was shutting down faster than anyone had predicted. The stage 4 diagnosis in September had given her 3 to 6 months. It was now mid-February, barely 5 months later, and her liver was failing. Her kidneys were compromised. Pain management was all they could offer. But Eleanor refused to increase her morphine dosage beyond the bare minimum. "It clouds my mind," she told the oncologist firmly. "And I need to be clear for what comes next." What came next was the most intensive evidence-gathering operation I'd ever been part of, conducted in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and approaching death. Margaret arrived within an hour of Eleanor's confession, carrying recording equipment and her laptop. Diana came with her investigative files ready to cross-reference Eleanor's memories with documented facts. Robert brought financial records dating back to 2000. We transformed Eleanor's private room into a war room, working against a deadline none of us wanted to acknowledge. Eleanor's memories, suppressed for decades, came pouring out with startling precision. She remembered the exact time she'd seen Charles near David's car, 11:47 p.m. on March 13, 2000. She knew because she'd checked her watch, already feeling uneasy about Charles's presence at that hour. She'd written down the phone number Charles had been calling, kept it in a journal she'd maintained for 25 years, but never had the courage to trace. Diana ran it immediately. The number belonged to a burner phone long disconnected, but the pattern of calls from Charles's cell phone to that number in the days before David's death would be damning evidence. Eleanor remembered the name of the mechanic shop where David had his brakes serviced, Riverside Auto, owned by a man named Thomas Kirk. Kirk was dead now, died in 2005, another single-car accident involving brake failure that no one had thought to question. But his business records still existed, stored in a warehouse by his son. Diana was already making calls to track them down. Each detail Eleanor provided was a thread. Individually, they might be dismissed as circumstantial. Together, they were forming a rope strong enough to hang a guilty man. On February 22nd, Eleanor summoned her strength for one final crucial task. She had Margaret bring a notary public to the hospital along with her doctor and a video recording specialist. "I'm making a formal video deposition," Eleanor announced, her voice weak but determined. "I'm going to tell the truth about David's death, about Charles's threats, about 25 years of cowardice. And I'm doing it now while I'm still legally competent to testify, so no one can claim I was confused or medicated into unreliability." The deposition took 2 hours. Eleanor spoke directly to the camera, methodical and clear despite her exhaustion. She detailed everything: seeing Charles near the car, hearing his phone conversation, finding her witness statement buried by police, being threatened into silence, watching her nephew's daughter grow up under the control of his murderer. The notary certified her mental competence. Her doctor confirmed she was lucid and understood the gravity of her testimony. It was the most courageous thing I'd ever witnessed. 6 days later at 3:17 in the morning on February 28th, Eleanor Parker died with my hand in hers. I'd fallen asleep in the chair beside her bed, jolted awake by the change in her breathing. The machines around us began their final chorus of alarms, but Eleanor's eyes were open, focused on my face. Her last words were whispered so softly, I had to lean in until my ear was nearly touching her lips. "Don't let him bury me the way he buried your father. Make them see. Make them understand." And then she was gone. The nurse came in silenced. The machines noted the time of death with practiced efficiency. But before the hospital could begin its standard procedures, Eleanor had one final gift for me. She'd asked the nurse to retrieve a lockbox from the hospital safe, with instructions to give it to me immediately upon her death. Inside was evidence Eleanor had protected for 25 years, the original notarized memo David had given her before his death, her personal journal documenting every detail she'd witnessed, and the flash drive containing her complete video deposition. Under Federal Rules of Evidence, 804b2, a dying person's declaration about the cause or circumstances of their impending death is admissible in court, even though they can't be cross-examined. Eleanor had planned her death as carefully as she'd lived, her silence making sure her truth would outlive her. I was standing in the hallway an hour later, phone in hand, preparing to make the courtesy calls to James and Anna when I saw him. Charles Montgomery, 80 years old, standing by the elevator bank. He'd been there all night, I realized, waiting for Eleanor to die. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and for one brief second I saw something that might have been genuine grief cross his face. Eleanor had been his sister-in-law for 50 years after all. Then his expression hardened into something cold and calculated. "Eleanor was sick for a long time," he said quietly. "Cancer, yes, but also paranoia, confusion. Whatever she told you in those final weeks, whatever accusations she made." He paused. "Courts understand that dying people often become delusional, especially when manipulated by relatives with financial motives." He stepped into the elevator, but held the door open for one final message. "Your aunt is dead, Rachel, and dead women can't testify. You're alone now." The elevator doors closed on his face, and I stood there holding Eleanor's lockbox, feeling the weight of everything she'd entrusted to me. Charles was wrong about one thing. Eleanor could still testify, and I was going to make damn sure everyone heard her. Eleanor's death felt like the end of everything, but she'd planned it as a beginning. 3 days after her funeral, Margaret called me to her office to review Eleanor's will, which had been revised just 3 weeks before she died. I expected maybe a small bequest, a sentimental token. What I got was a battle plan executed from beyond the grave. Eleanor's personal estate, $4 million, kept separate from the trust, was transferred in its entirety to a newly created foundation, Eleanor's Voice, protecting seniors from financial abuse. The foundation's charter outlined its mission with precision that could only have come from someone who'd spent 25 years planning her final act of defiance. And its first action, triggered automatically by pre-programmed instructions, was to file a wrongful death lawsuit against Charles Montgomery. The legal theory was ambitious, maybe even a long shot. The suit alleged that Charles's decades of trust mismanagement, combined with his direct threats to Eleanor in 2005 and again in recent months, had created stress that directly accelerated her terminal illness. Proving causation would be nearly impossible. But Eleanor hadn't done this to win a wrongful death settlement. She'd done it to make her video deposition public record. The lawsuit included the entire 2-hour recording as supporting evidence. Suddenly, Eleanor's testimony about witnessing Charles near David's car, about hearing him give instructions to make it look natural, about 25 years of threats and intimidation, all of it became accessible to every journalist in Massachusetts. The Riverside Chronicle, which had run character assassination pieces about me just weeks earlier, was forced to cover Eleanor's accusations. The headline read, "Dying Woman's Deathbed. Accusation Montgomery threatened silence about son's death." Other papers picked it up. Television stations requested copies of the deposition. Charles's carefully constructed narrative of a vindictive granddaughter was being dismantled by a dead woman's testimony. While Eleanor's foundation was executing its public warfare strategy, the bank audit that had been grinding through documents for 6 weeks hit a critical threshold. Federal banking regulations are clear: when fraud exceeds $10 million in a federally insured institution, it must be referred to the FBI. The audit team's preliminary findings identified $87 million in questionable loans, $45 million in excessive fees, and at least $2.5 million in forged documents. On March 15th, I was in Margaret's office reviewing discovery documents when Diana burst in with news the FBI had just executed a federal search warrant at Riverside Community Bank. Special agents from the White Collar Crime Division arrived with moving trucks and forensic accountants. They seized servers, locked down physical files, cordoned off entire departments. Staff members were interviewed one by one, advised of their rights, asked to provide passwords and access codes. Douglas Whitmore retained criminal defense counsel within 2 hours. Victoria was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The bank issued a statement so carefully worded, it was clearly drafted by attorneys terrified of saying too much. Riverside Community Bank is cooperating fully with federal authorities investigating alleged irregularities in certain trust accounts. Charles's wall of institutional protection, built over 50 years of strategic relationships and careful patronage, was crumbling in real time. But perhaps the most significant shift came from the people Charles had spent decades controlling through fear and dependence. Eleanor's public accusations, combined with media coverage that finally questioned the Montgomery family's reputation, gave other victims permission to speak up. Over 3 weeks in March, 17 families filed formal complaints with the Massachusetts Attorney General. Elderly people who'd lost portions of their trusts to excessive fees. Adult children who'd watched their parents' estates drain away under Charles's management. Beneficiaries who'd been told their concerns were inappropriate, their questions insulting to a respected trustee. The pattern was damning fees far above industry standards, loans approved without beneficiary knowledge or consent, distributions delayed for years without explanation, questions met with intimidation disguised as professionalism. Each case individually might have been dismissed as a private family dispute. Together, they demonstrated systematic abuse on a scale that demanded criminal investigation. The Attorney General's office opened a civil investigation on March 23rd. The focus whether Charles Montgomery had violated his fiduciary duties so extensively that it warranted revocation of his license to serve as a trustee and potential criminal charges for elder abuse. For the first time in 50 years, Charles faced the possibility of losing not just one case but his entire professional reputation. And without that reputation, he had nothing. No power. No protection. No way to make problems disappear. I was beginning to believe we might actually win when the call came that changed everything again. March 31st, late afternoon. Margaret's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. FBI. Agent Sarah Martinez introduced herself and got straight to the point. "We've located the mechanic shop records from your father's car accident." Riverside Auto had gone out of business in 2010, but Thomas Kirk's son had kept all the files. According to their logs, David Parker's vehicle was serviced on March 12, 2000. The brake system was certified in perfect condition. 3 days later, those brakes failed catastrophically. "But there's something else," Martinez continued. "A handwritten note from Thomas Kirk, dated March 14th, 2 days before your father's death. It says, customer's father-in-law asked about brake maintenance schedules. Seemed odd. Told him system was new, should last 50,000 miles. He asked specific questions about failure points, logged for liability purposes." My chest tightened. The father-in-law was Charles Montgomery. We believe Thomas Kirk realized later what those questions meant. We need to know, did he ever try to contact authorities? Diana was already pulling up her investigation files, and when she found Kirk's name, her face went white. "Thomas Kirk died in 2005, she said quietly. "Single car accident, cause brake failure." The news about Thomas Kirk's death, another suspicious brake failure, another person who might have exposed Charles, silenced permanently, should have been the focus of everything. But Diana had been running parallel investigations, and what she discovered about Victoria changed the entire dynamic of our case. "I was doing a standard employment background check," Diana explained, spreading documents across Margaret's conference table. "Pulling Victoria's birth certificate, education records, the usual verification work for a potential witness. And I found something that doesn't add up. Victoria's birth certificate listed Anna Parker as mother and James Parker as father, dated April 15, 2002. Standard enough. But Diana's deeper research into James's personal history revealed a relationship that predated his marriage to Anna, a relationship that had produced a daughter in late 2001. James had a girlfriend before David died, Diana said. She got pregnant in early 2001, gave birth in December of that year. According to records I found, James initially planned to raise the baby with her, but she left Riverside in March 2000, right around the time David died. She left the baby with James." I felt the pieces clicking into place. When Charles forced James to marry Anna, part of the deal was that Anna would raise James's daughter as her own, Diana finished. It gave the marriage legitimacy, a ready-made family, the appearance of normalcy. Victoria wasn't born into the Montgomery family dynamic. She was absorbed into it, used to create a cover story that made James and Anna's rushed marriage look sympathetic instead of suspicious. Margaret thought I was making a mistake when I told her I wanted to tell Victoria the truth. "She's a potential hostile witness. Why give her information that could help her defense? Because she deserves to know how she's been used," I said, "and because someone needs to break the cycle of lies in this family." I met Victoria at a coffee shop 40 miles outside Riverside neutral territory, where neither of us would be recognized. She arrived looking hollowed out, the polished confidence I'd seen at the bank replaced by exhaustion and fear. 2 weeks of administrative leave, FBI interviews, and watching her entire professional world collapse had stripped away the armor. I slid the documents across the table without preamble. Birth certificates, relationship records, timeline documentation. "You spent your whole life thinking you were the real daughter, the legitimate one," I said quietly. "But you weren't born to Anna and James's marriage. You existed before it. You were the reason they could marry so quickly without raising questions. They had a ready-made family to present." Victoria stared at the papers like they were written in a language she couldn't comprehend. "I don't understand. Why would they lie to me?" "Because Charles needed a family that looked normal. A widow marrying her husband's brother to care for his orphaned daughter, that's a sympathetic story. But a forced marriage covering up a murder that raises questions. You were the cover story, Victoria, just like I was the scapegoat." I watched my half-sister's face as 22 years of identity crumbled. Every assumption she'd built her life on, that she was chosen, favored deserving of success, while I deserved neglect, all of it constructed by Charles to serve his purposes. She didn't cry. She just sat there staring at documents that rewrote her entire existence. "Who am I then?" she finally whispered. For 3 days, Victoria didn't answer calls or leave her apartment. Her therapist later told the FBI it was a complete identity dissolution, the psychological equivalent of a building's foundation giving way. On the 4th day, my phone rang. "Tell me how to make this right." 7 words delivered with the flat affect of someone beyond caring about consequences. "Talk to the FBI," I said carefully. "Tell them everything you know about trust operations, every document Charles had you sign, every conversation that seemed wrong. They'll offer immunity if you cooperate before indictment." Silence. And then what? Who am I if I'm not a Montgomery? The question broke my heart a little. You become whoever you should have been before they told you who to be. Victoria agreed to cooperate, but with one condition that made Margaret furious and Diana nervous. She wanted to confront Charles first. "I need to hear him admit it," Victoria said when she came to Margaret's office the next day. "Admit he used me, forged my signature, that everything I thought was real was just part of his plan. I need to look him in the eye and see if there's any remorse." "This could spook him," I warned. "He might destroy evidence, might flee." I'm not doing this for your case, Rachel. I'm doing this for me. I need to know if any of it was real, if he ever actually cared about me, or if I was always just a tool. The FBI agreed to wire her. The meeting was set for April 15th, Victoria's 23rd birthday, the cruelest possible timing. Charles's study, the same room where he'd threatened David 25 years ago. When Victoria walked through that door wearing a concealed recording device, Charles looked up from his desk and smiled. "I was wondering when you'd come," he said calmly. "You're wearing a wire, of course, FBI outside or just listening remotely." Victoria froze. "I've been outmaneuvering law enforcement since before you were born, my dear. Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" I was sitting in the FBI surveillance van 3 blocks from Charles's house, listening through headphones as my sister's entire world collapsed in real time. The moment Charles said, "You're wearing a wire," Agent Martinez reached for her radio to call the operation off to get Victoria out before the situation became dangerous. But Charles kept talking. "I've been evading law enforcement for 50 years, Victoria." His voice came through clear despite the hidden microphone. "I know what desperation looks like. I know what betrayal sounds like. And I can see both in your eyes right now." Victoria's breathing was audible through the wire, rapid and shallow. But she didn't run. She stood there in that study, wearing the designer dress Charles had bought her for her 21st birthday, and she waited. "The question isn't whether you're recording this," Charles continued, and I heard him move, probably walking around the desk. "The question is, do you actually want to know the truth? Because once you hear it, you can't unhear it. And the truth is uglier than whatever story Rachel has been telling you." Agent Martinez looked at me silently, asking if we should intervene. I shook my head. Victoria had come this far. She deserved to hear what she'd come for. What followed was the most chilling confession I'd ever heard, not because it was emotional, but because it was utterly clinical. "Your Uncle David was going to destroy this family over principles," Charles said, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing a business decision. 50 million in improper loans, he called it. But those loans built the senior center that serves 300 elderly people daily. They funded the scholarship program that sent 42 low-income students to college. They supported the art museum that provides free programs to school children. David saw theft. I saw redistribution, taking from a trust that was hoarding wealth and putting it to immediate community use. "You killed him." Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. "I ensured the trust's survival." No denial, no hedge, just cold acknowledgement. David was going to alert regulators, freeze all funds, destroy decades of charitable work because he couldn't understand that sometimes good outcomes require morally ambiguous means. So yes, I arranged his accident. I've lived with that decision for 25 years. Would I make it again? Ask the 300 seniors who have health care because of my theft. Agent Martinez was recording every word, but her face had gone pale. Even federal agents who'd prosecuted dozens of murder cases seemed stunned by the casual way Charles discussed killing his own son. Victoria's voice came through the wire again, shaking but determined. "Did you ever care about me? Or was I always just a tool?" The silence that followed was long enough that I thought the connection had failed. Then Charles answered with words that were somehow crueler than any rage or violence could have been. "I cared about what you represented: stability, continuity, the appearance of a family moving forward after tragedy. Do I love you as an individual human?" He paused. "Victoria, I'm 80 years old. I've spent half a century managing assets and people and outcomes. Love is a variable I stopped calculating decades ago." I heard movement through the wire, Charles walking to the window. I would learn later. "You want me to say I'm sorry. I'm sorry you were born into a world where power matters more than sentiment. But I'm not sorry for protecting that power. Someone has to make the hard choices, Victoria. I did. David didn't. And that's why he's dead, and I'm still here." The recording captured every word. It wasn't quite a full confession to murder in legal terms. Charles was too careful to say, "I killed David Parker" explicitly. But it was enough to destroy any defense claiming ignorance or good faith. Combined with Dr. Webb's testimony, Anna's cooperation, and the forensic evidence we'd gathered, this recording would bury Charles Montgomery. Victoria left her grandfather's house 20 minutes later and drove directly to the FBI field office in Boston. Agent Martinez and I followed in the surveillance van, arriving to find Victoria already in an interview room staring at the wall with empty eyes. The debriefing took 6 hours. Victoria provided context for every document she'd signed, every transaction she'd processed, every conversation with Charles that had seemed strange, but she'd dismissed. She was methodical, exhausted, and utterly broken. When she finally emerged at midnight, I was waiting in the parking lot. The FBI had called me, said Victoria's cooperation was secured, asked if I wanted to be present when she finished. I'd driven an hour through rain to be there, though I wasn't entirely sure why. Victoria saw me and stopped. We looked at each other across the expanse of grief and manipulation that had separated us for 22 years. She spoke first. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect understanding. But I want you to know I'm testifying. Against him, against the bank, against everyone who was part of this. Not because I'm noble, but because I'm done being a weapon in someone else's war." The honesty in her voice was new, raw, in a way Victoria had never allowed herself to be. "That's the first honest thing you've ever said to me," I replied quietly. "It's a start." Victoria's cooperation gave us Charles's recorded admission, but federal prosecutors wanted more. A defense attorney could argue the recording was ambiguous, that "arranged his accident" could mean something other than murder, that Charles was an old man being manipulated by an estranged granddaughter. We needed corroborating testimony from someone who could describe the mechanics of how the murder was executed. We needed Dr. Harrison Webb. Webb's cooperation agreement was finalized on May 1st. At 71 years old, facing the possibility of spending his final years in federal prison as an accessory to murder, Webb made a calculation that thousands of defendants make every year immunity in exchange for testimony was preferable to loyalty to a man who'd used him as an unwitting accomplice. His statement to the FBI was delivered over 3 days in a secure interview room in Boston. I wasn't allowed to attend witness contamination rules, but Agent Martinez shared the transcripts with me each evening, and what emerged was the most detailed account yet of how my father's death had been orchestrated. Webb described receiving a phone call from Charles on March 13, 2000, 2 days before the accident that killed David. Charles had framed it as a favor between old friends. Could Harrison take a look at David's car? Father's prerogative, wanting to make sure his son was maintaining the vehicle properly, especially with a baby on the way. Webb, who'd been Charles's personal physician for years, and had borrowed $3 million from the trust at virtually no interest for a real estate investment, didn't question the request. He went to David's house that evening, inspected the brake system with the thoroughness of someone who'd grown up working on cars before medical school, and found everything in perfect mechanical condition. He even provided Charles with a written certification to that effect. "I didn't understand what I was doing," Webb told the FBI agents. "He didn't ask me to sabotage anything. He needed my medical credibility, my reputation as a physician, to establish that the car was mechanically sound before the accident. That way, when the brakes failed 2 days later, investigators would assume it was sudden mechanical failure or driver error, not tampering. I provided an alibi for murder without even knowing it." But what made Webb's testimony truly damning was the pattern he'd noticed over the years. Every time Charles needed to solve what he called a problem person, someone who threatened to expose him, someone who asked too many questions, that person died in what appeared to be an accident involving mechanical failure. A business partner who'd threatened to expose financial irregularities in 2003 died in a small plane crash. Mechanical failure, the NTSB report concluded. A former bank employee who'd threatened to sue over wrongful termination in 2008 died in a house fire caused by faulty wiring. And Thomas Kirk, the mechanic who'd certified David's brakes and later asked questions about Charles's interest in brake failure points, died in 2005. Single car accident. Brake failure. Webb couldn't prove Charles had orchestrated all these deaths, but he could testify to a pattern of suspicious accidents surrounding people who threatened Charles's interests, a pattern that would make David's death look less like an isolated tragedy and more like standard operating procedure for a man who'd spent 50 years eliminating obstacles. The most damning piece of Webb's testimony concerned Eleanor. In 2005, the same year she'd tried to alert the FBI, Charles came to Webb's office for what he claimed was a routine checkup. During the examination, he mentioned casually that Eleanor had been acting paranoid lately, stressed, possibly experiencing early cognitive decline. He asked Webb as a favor to suggest Eleanor undergo a psychiatric evaluation. Webb understood immediately what Charles was asking. He refused. Charles's response was delivered with the same casual menace I'd heard in his voice when he threatened me. "That's disappointing, Harrison. I'd hate for the medical board to receive information about certain prescription irregularities in your practice." Webb caved. He provided a letter suggesting Eleanor was experiencing stress-related cognitive issues, a letter Charles used to discredit her FBI report and shut down the investigation. Webb had kept a copy for 18 years, knowing it might someday be the only thing standing between him and a murder conspiracy charge. He was right. With Victoria's recording and Webb's testimony, federal prosecutors had everything they needed. On May 15th, a federal grand jury issued a sealed indictment charging Charles Montgomery with conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, trust fraud, and wire fraud. The indictment remained sealed while FBI agents coordinated with Massachusetts State Police to execute the arrest warrant. The plan was simple. 7 a.m. on May 20th, agents would arrive at Charles's residence and take him into custody. But on May 19th at 11 p.m. my phone rang. Diana, her voice tight with urgency. "Charles's private jet just filed a flight plan to Geneva, Switzerland. Departure time 6 a.m. tomorrow morning." 1 hour before his scheduled arrest. "How does he know?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Sealed indictments leak. Someone at the courthouse, someone in law enforcement, someone who owes Charles a favor. It doesn't matter how. What matters is he's running. And if he makes it to Switzerland, extradition will take years. He might die of old age before we ever get him in front of a jury." Diana's call about Charles's flight plan to Switzerland triggered immediate action. Agent Martinez contacted her superiors, who made the decision in under 5 minutes, move the arrest up by 12 hours. If Charles was planning to flee at 6 a.m., they'd take him into custody at 6 p.m. that same evening. I drove to Riverside with Diana, parking 3 blocks from Charles's estate where we could see but not interfere. At exactly 6 p.m., 4 unmarked vehicles pulled into the circular driveway. Federal agents and Massachusetts State Police emerged with the controlled efficiency of people executing a plan they'd rehearsed. The front door opened before they could knock. Charles Montgomery stood there in the doorway of the mansion he'd occupied for 50 years, dressed in a suit and tie as if he'd been expecting them. Maybe he had been. Maybe someone had tipped him off about the moved timeline, just as someone had warned him about the original arrest plan. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "I assume you have a warrant." Agent Martinez presented it. Charles read it thoroughly. Even now, even in the moment of his arrest, he maintained absolute control. Then he nodded and said 5 words. "May I call my attorney?" The arrest was professional, almost courteous. No handcuffs, no perp walk, just 2 agents escorting an 80-year-old man to an unmarked SUV for the drive to Boston. But word spread through Riverside with the speed that only small-town gossip can achieve. By the time the motorcade reached the federal courthouse for Charles's arraignment, news vans had assembled like sharks drawn to blood. The indictment was unsealed, and suddenly every detail became public conspiracy to commit murder in the death of David Parker. Obstruction of justice spanning 25 years, systematic trust fraud, wire fraud involving forged documents. I watched from the gallery as Charles Montgomery, who'd controlled Riverside for half a century, stood before Judge Patricia Morrison in an orange jumpsuit. The man who'd worn custom suits and carried a cane carved from African blackwood now looked small, diminished, stripped of the trappings of power that had protected him for so long. The assistant U.S. attorney was a woman named Jennifer Reeves, sharp-eyed and methodical. Her argument for detention without bail was devastating in its precision. The defendant has significant financial resources, international connections, and a documented history of witness intimidation spanning 25 years. He was preparing to flee the country when arrested. His private jet had filed a flight plan to Switzerland, departing tomorrow morning. He poses an extreme flight risk and a continued danger to witnesses who've cooperated with this investigation. Martin Vance Charles's attorney made his counter-argument with the smooth desperation of someone defending the indefensible. His client was an 80-year-old pillar of the community with no criminal record. House arrest with electronic monitoring would be appropriate. The charges were serious, but largely circumstantial. Judge Morrison reviewed the indictment, Webb's testimony, and the transcript of Victoria's recorded conversation with Charles. Her decision was delivered without hesitation. The defendant is remanded to federal custody pending trial. Bail is denied. For the first time in his life, Charles Montgomery would sleep in a cell. The patriarch had become prisoner number 2025-443 FCI. The Boston Globe's headline the next morning read, "Riverside Patriarch Arrested in Decades-Old Murder Trust Fraud Scheme." Other papers picked it up. Television stations ran segments. The story that Charles had spent 25 years burying was now broadcast across New England. Riverside's reaction split exactly along the fault lines you'd expect. The establishment country club members, the Historical Society Board, the Art Museum patrons rallied to Charles's defense with the predictable talking points. He'd built this town. These charges were politically motivated. The stress of the investigation had probably confused elderly witnesses. But a counter-narrative emerged from people who'd been silenced for too long. Seniors who'd watched their trusts drain away through excessive fees. Young families who'd left Riverside because they couldn't afford to stay despite working full-time. People who'd been told for decades that questioning Charles Montgomery was inappropriate, ungrateful, vindictive. A protest formed outside the courthouse, 50 people holding signs reading, "Believe Survivors," and "Justice for David Parker." Patricia Hendricks, the 74-year-old who'd witnessed Victoria humiliating me at the bank, gave an interview to every reporter who'd listen. "I've watched powerful men in this town operate above the law my entire life," she said. "Maybe this time is different. Maybe this time, money doesn't buy silence." Even the Riverside Chronicle, which had published character assassination pieces about me just months ago, ran a front-page editorial titled, "We Were Wrong." The editors admitted they'd failed in their duty to question power, that they'd been too comfortable accepting Charles's narrative, that they should have asked hard questions years ago. It was the beginning of accountability, incomplete and imperfect, but real. On June 1st, my phone rang with a number I recognized, Martin Vance Charles's attorney. "My client would like to speak with you," Vance said carefully. "In person at the Federal Detention Center with guards present. He says there are things you deserve to know about your father. Things Eleanor never told you. Things that might change how you see this entire case." My team's advice was immediate and unanimous. Don't go. It's manipulation, an attempt to plant doubt before trial. But after 25 years of not knowing my father, I wanted to hear what the man who killed him had to say. The visit was scheduled for June 5th. Diana would accompany me, and every word would be recorded. The Federal Detention Center was exactly what you'd expect: institutional gray fluorescent lighting that made everyone look sick, the smell of disinfectant failing to cover the underlying odor of too many bodies in too little space. Diana accompanied me through security, through metal detectors and pat-downs, and the bureaucratic machinery of incarceration. She'd be in an adjacent room recording everything through equipment the FBI had provided. The visiting area was a row of plastic chairs bolted to the floor, separated from the prisoner's side by plexiglass barriers. Communication happened through phones mounted on the wall. Everything was designed to prevent physical contact, to maintain the distance between the free world and the incarcerated one. Charles Montgomery was already seated when I entered. The orange jumpsuit hung loosely on his frame, making him look smaller than I remembered. 80 years old, facing life in prison, stripped of the mahogany desk and leather furniture that had armored him for 50 years. But when he looked up and his eyes met mine through the plexiglass, they were still sharp, still calculating. I picked up the phone on my side. He did the same. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice scratchy through the poor connection. "I imagine your advisors told you this was a mistake." I didn't respond. I just waited, using the silence the way I'd learned to in client interviews. Let them fill the void, let them reveal themselves. "I'm not going to apologize," Charles continued. "I'm not going to claim I was acting in anyone's best interest but my own. But I am going to tell you the truth about your father, because you deserve to know who you're avenging." He slid a folder under the plexiglass barrier, pushing it through the narrow slot designed for document exchange. Inside were photocopies of letters I'd never seen before, my father's handwriting, which I recognized from the few documents Eleanor had kept. Letters to Charles dated March 2000. Angry, accusatory, righteous. "Your father found approximately $50 million in what he called improper loans," Charles said, watching me read. "Money I'd distributed to community projects without formal trust board approval. He was technically correct. I'd violated fiduciary procedures. But he was also fundamentally naive." I looked up from the letters and Charles leaned forward, slightly warming to his theme. The trust had $4.5 billion sitting in conservative investments, earning 3 to 4% annually, while Riverside had seniors dying from lack of healthcare access, students graduating without college prospects, community infrastructure crumbling. I used that money to build a senior center that serves 300 elderly people daily. I funded scholarships that sent 42 low-income students to college. I repaired historic buildings, supported the art museum, created programs for underprivileged children. His voice carried the conviction of someone who'd spent 25 years perfecting this justification. "Illegal, yes. Immoral." He paused. "I'd argue the immorality was hoarding wealth while people suffered. Your father saw the world in legal and illegal. I saw it in necessary and unnecessary. And I decided his ideology was less important than 300 seniors having access to health care." He stopped, and the silence stretched between us. "So yes, I killed him. And I'd do it again." The casual admission, delivered through a phone line in a federal detention center with guards watching and recording equipment running, should have shocked me. But I'd heard the wire recording of his conversation with Victoria. I'd read Webb's testimony. What struck me instead was the narrative Charles had constructed, this Robin Hood mythology, where he was the misunderstood hero stealing from the rich to give to the poor. "You're very good at that story," I said quietly. "The charitable redistribution, the community benefit, the greater good justifying necessary evils." Charles tilted his head, slightly interested. "But I notice what you're not mentioning," I continued. "The $45 million in excessive management fees paid to your own consulting firms. The loans to friends at rates so low they were essentially gifts. The forgery, the witness intimidation, the systematic cover-up. Your narrative very carefully omits the part where you got rich in the process." For the first time, something flickered in Charles's expression. Not shame, I don't think he was capable of that, but maybe acknowledgement that I'd seen through his performance. "You're not Robin Hood," I said. "You're a man who killed his son to protect a theft scheme and spent 25 years convincing yourself it was noble. The senior center you built, it's beautiful. I'm sure it helps people. But it's built on my father's grave, and no amount of community benefit erases murder." Charles leaned back in his plastic chair, and something that might have been respect crossed his face. "You're more like David than I expected," he said. "Same moral certainty, same inability to see nuance, same conviction that the world is simple good and evil legal and illegal right and wrong." I stood to leave, ready to end this conversation that was going exactly where I'd expected it to go. "There's one thing Eleanor never told you," Charles said, and the shift in his tone made me pause. One thing no one told you because they were all too busy protecting you from the truth. I sat back down slowly. Your father wasn't planning to just report the trust fraud to regulators, Charles said. He was planning to dissolve the entire trust, return all the money to the original donors' estates, shut down every program, every scholarship, every initiative. He was going to destroy 75 years of family legacy, over 50 million in procedural violations. I searched his face for signs of manipulation for the lie designed to plant doubt. I offered him a compromise, Charles continued. Independent oversight, transparent accounting, maintained charitable programs with proper documentation. He refused. He wanted scorched earth, wanted to prove a point about accountability, even if it meant 300 seniors losing healthcare access, even if it meant 42 students losing their scholarships. Charles's expression was almost sad now, and that frightened me more than anger would have. Your father was a zealot, Rachel. And zealots don't compromise. They'd rather destroy everything than accept that the world requires moral complexity. He paused. I hope you're not one too, because the world breaks zealots. I should know. I broke one 25 years ago. Charles's words about my father being a zealot stayed with me for weeks, burrowing into my thoughts during sleepless nights. Was he right? Had David been so rigid in his morality that he would have destroyed beneficial programs to make a point about accountability? Or was this just Charles's final manipulation, a last attempt to make me doubt the man I was fighting for? I didn't have answers. But I had evidence. And in September 2025, that evidence was presented to a jury in U.S. District Court, Boston. The trial of Charles Montgomery began on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind of weather that matched the gravity of what we were about to undertake. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Reeves led the prosecution with the methodical precision of someone who'd built her career on complex, white-collar cases. She laid out the charges in her opening statement with devastating clarity: conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, trust, fraud, wire fraud. 25 years of calculated criminality dressed up as community service. Over 8 weeks, the prosecution constructed their case brick by brick. Dr. Harrison Webb testified for 2 full days, describing how Charles had used him to create an alibi for murder by certifying David's brakes were in perfect condition days before they catastrophically failed. Webb's voice shook when he admitted his own complicity when he described the pattern of suspicious deaths surrounding people who threatened Charles. Victoria's recorded conversation was played for the jury in week 3. The courtroom fell silent as Charles's voice filled the space. I arranged his accident. I've lived with that decision for 25 years. Would I make it again? Ask the 300 seniors who have health care because of my theft. When I watched the jurors' faces, several looked sick. Anna testified in week 4 describing 25 years of coercion that started 3 days after my father's funeral. She explained how Charles had fabricated evidence against David, how he'd threatened Eleanor, how he'd forced Anna to sign documents she didn't understand, and practice my signature until she could forge it perfectly. Under Jennifer Reeves's questioning, she was steady and clear. Under cross-examination, Martin Vance tried to paint her as a bitter ex-wife seeking revenge. The jury didn't buy it. Robert Torres presented the forensic accounting evidence in week 5, 87 million in fraudulent loans, 45 million in excessive fees, systematic theft disguised as management. He showed the jury how Charles had enriched himself while claiming to help others, how the charitable redistribution narrative carefully omitted the consulting fees paid to his own firms, the sweetheart loans to friends, the personal wealth accumulated at the trust's expense. And in week 6, Eleanor testified from beyond the grave. Her video deposition was played on large monitors, positioned so the jury could see her clearly. Eleanor thin and pale in her hospital bed, but sharp-eyed and determined, describing 25 years of silence born from fear. She told them about seeing Charles near David's car, about hearing him give instructions to make it look natural, about trying to report it in 2005 and being crushed so thoroughly she never spoke up again. When the video ended, I saw 2 jurors wiping their eyes. The defense rested after just 3 days. Martin Vance attempted to portray Charles as a dedicated public servant, whose aggressive trust management style had been misinterpreted by family members with financial motives. But he couldn't explain the forged signatures. He couldn't explain Webb's testimony about the car inspection. He couldn't explain Charles's own recorded words admitting he'd arranged David's accident. The prosecution had built a case so airtight there was nothing left to argue. Victim impact statements came during the sentencing phase. I spoke for 15 minutes standing at a podium facing Judge Morrison, while Charles sat at the defense table in his orange jumpsuit, expressionless. I grew up in a house where my father's murderer was called Grandpa. I said, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to crack it. Every family dinner was attended by the man who ensured I'd never know David Parker. I don't know if my father was a zealot, as Charles claims. I only know he tried to do the right thing and he was killed for it. This trial isn't just about trust fraud or forged documents. It's about whether we live in a society where powerful people can murder those who threaten their interests and face no consequences. I was followed by 17 families, elderly people who'd lost portions of their trusts to Charles's schemes, adult children who'd watched their parents' estates drain away beneficiaries who'd been told their questions were inappropriate. One by one, they told stories of betrayal disguised as professional management. The jury listened in absolute silence. On January 15, 2026, exactly 1 year and 2 weeks after Eleanor's death, the jury returned their verdict after 11 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all counts. Charles showed no visible reaction as each verdict was read. He sat perfectly still, that same controlled composure he'd maintained throughout the trial, as if he still believed his power could protect him. Sentencing occurred 2 weeks later. Judge Patricia Morrison reviewed the sentencing guidelines, the evidence presented, and Charles's complete lack of remorse. Her voice was firm as she delivered the maximum sentence allowed by law. Life in prison without possibility of parole for the murder conspiracy, she stated. Plus 48 additional years for fraud charges to run consecutively. You have demonstrated throughout this trial that you believe yourself above the law, above morality, above accountability. This court disagrees. You will spend whatever time remains to you contemplating the lives you destroyed in service of your ego. Charles Montgomery was 80 years old. He would die in federal prison. The gavel fell with a sound that felt like finality. Outside the courthouse, I stood on the steps with my team, Margaret, Robert, Diana, and gave a brief statement to the assembled media. This verdict doesn't bring my father back. It doesn't undo 25 years of lies. But it confirms something important: silence isn't strength and patience isn't weakness. The powerful want you to believe that fighting back is futile, that systems protect them, that justice is reserved for people who can afford it. Today proved otherwise. I was flanked by my team and unexpectedly by Victoria. She'd spent 4 months in intensive therapy and community service as part of her plea agreement, working at the same nonprofit where I'd built my career. She stood beside me now, and when a photographer snapped our picture, I saw what the image would show: 2 half-sisters who'd grown up as enemies, standing together, having survived the man who tried to destroy them both. "What happens to the trust now?" a reporter called out. I smiled slightly. That's the beginning of a different story. Charles's conviction marked an ending, but endings in real life are messy, requiring months of cleanup work that never makes it into headlines. While he began serving his life sentence at FCI Devons, the legal machinery ground forward with the unglamorous work of restitution and accountability. The Eleanor Parker Trust underwent complete restructuring under court supervision. Judge Morrison appointed an independent trustee, a trust law specialist from New York, with no prior connection to Riverside or the Montgomery family. Her name was Catherine Walsh, and her first task was performing a comprehensive audit to determine the full scope of damage Charles had inflicted over 25 years. The numbers when they came in were staggering: $132 million in improper distributions, $45 million in excessive fees paid to Charles's consulting firms, $87 million in fraudulent loans that would never be repaid. The trust, that should have been worth nearly $5 billion, had been systematically looted for decades. Charles's personal assets were seized under criminal forfeiture laws. His mansion, $8 million. Investment accounts, $14 million. The art collection he'd assembled over 50 years, $3 million. Offshore holdings in the Cayman Islands that prosecutors had traced, $12 million. All of it liquidated, all of it directed toward restitution. It wasn't enough to make victims whole. The math didn't work. But 17 families who'd lost portions of their inheritances to Charles's schemes received pro rata distributions checks that couldn't undo the betrayal, but at least acknowledged it. The senior center that Charles had claimed justified his crimes remained open. Catherine Walsh made sure of that, reorganizing it under independent nonprofit management with transparent accounting and proper oversight. It was proof she told me that charitable work doesn't require criminal methods. You can help people without stealing from them. The two aren't mutually exclusive, no matter what Charles had convinced himself. Victoria's reckoning came in a different form. Her plea agreement spared her prison time, but required 500 hours of community service, 3 years of probation, and a lifetime ban from working in financial services. She could have fulfilled those hours anywhere, picking up trash along highways, serving meals at soup kitchens, any number of anonymous ways to check boxes and move on. Instead, she chose Elder Advocacy Network in San Francisco. I learned about it from my former supervisor, who called to ask if I had any objection to Victoria Parker joining as a community service volunteer. I could have said yes, I probably should have, but something in me wanted to see if my sister could actually change. The work was uncomfortable and humbling for someone who'd spent her career in positions of authority. Victoria helped elderly clients navigate complex trust documents, identified signs of financial abuse, and assisted with reporting suspicious activity. Clients who recognized her name from news coverage were skeptical, sometimes hostile. Why should they trust someone who'd been part of the system that had victimized so many? But over months, Victoria built a reputation for patient, thorough assistance. She listened without judgment. She explained legal jargon in plain language. She stayed late to help clients who needed extra time. She'd never be a hero in this story. Her redemption arc didn't erase what she'd participated in, even unknowingly. But she was learning to be something she hadn't been before, useful without needing to be superior. I watched from a distance, getting updates from colleagues, seeing the sister I might have had if Charles hadn't poisoned everything from the beginning. Riverside itself underwent a painful reckoning. The bank that had housed the trust for decades faced regulatory sanctions, $5 million in fines, mandatory ethics training for all staff, independent compliance audits for 5 years. Douglas Whitmore resigned in disgrace. 3 board members who'd enabled Charles's authority stepped down. The Riverside Chronicle, which had spent months attacking my credibility, published a multi-part investigative series examining how the town's elite institutions had functioned as a network protecting powerful men from accountability. The country club, the historical society, the art museum, all of them had benefited from Charles's philanthropy, and all of them had looked the other way when questions arose about where that money came from. It was uncomfortable reading for a community that prided itself on civility and tradition. But discomfort, as Eleanor had once told me, is how change begins. Patricia Hendricks, the 74-year-old who'd witnessed Victoria humiliating me at the bank and spoken up when others stayed silent, formed a new organization, Riverside Financial Justice Coalition. Its mission was monitoring trust management and advocating for stronger senior protection laws. Membership grew to 300 in the first 2 months, mostly elderly women who'd spent their lives being told not to ask questions, finally finding their voices. In early April, I received notice from Catherine Walsh that I was now legally entitled to access my portion of the Eleanor Parker Trust. I'd turned 25 in June of the previous year, the age when Charles's carefully constructed control was supposed to end. After restitution payments and legal fees, my share was valued at $1.4 billion. I sat with that paperwork for 3 days. Margaret suggested traditional investment strategies secure my financial future, fund retirement, provide for future generations. It was sensible advice. I could live comfortably for the rest of my life, never worry about money again, build the kind of security my mother had sacrificed everything to protect. But I kept thinking about Eleanor, who'd spent 25 years silent because she was too afraid to fight. About David, who'd died trying to hold Charles accountable. About the hundreds of elderly people who'd lost their savings to schemes exactly like what Charles had run people who didn't have the resources or knowledge or support to fight back. The decision, when I finally made it, surprised no one who actually knew me. I kept $10 million for modest financial security, enough to live on, enough to help family if needed, enough to never be desperate. The remaining $1.39 billion went to create the David Parker Foundation for Elder Financial Protection. The foundation's mission was clear: provide free legal representation to seniors facing trust abuse, fund financial literacy programs, and lobby for stronger fiduciary accountability laws. Eleanor's voice finally heard. David's principles finally honored. My fight transformed into something that could help others long after I was gone. The family legacy rebuilt on truth instead of lies. The David Parker Foundation launched in May 2026, exactly 18 months after Eleanor's death had set everything in motion. By June, we'd already received over 300 requests for assistance from families navigating trust disputes across New England. But before I could fully commit to that future, I needed to make peace with the past. I returned to Riverside on a Saturday morning for the dedication of the David Parker Memorial Garden, a small plot of land beside the senior center that Charles had built with stolen money. The center remained open under its new nonprofit management, but now it bore a plaque that Catherine Walsh had commissioned, funded through the Eleanor Parker Trust, restructured 2026 to honor honest service over hidden theft. The garden was modest, benches carved from local stone, walking paths lined with native plantings that would bloom through spring and summer. A simple fountain in the center. No statues, no grand monuments, just a quiet space for reflection. Eleanor would have approved. 200 people attended the dedication ceremony. Some had known David, colleagues from his brief time on the trust board, friends from college, neighbors who remembered the young man who'd died too young. But most hadn't known him at all. They were here because they understood what the garden represented. A town confronting its complicity, acknowledging that pretty buildings and generous donations don't erase the crimes committed to create them. I spoke for 10 minutes, standing beside the fountain with Margaret, Robert, Diana, and Victoria at my side. I didn't mention Charles. I didn't rehash the trial or detail his crimes. Instead, I talked about David Parker, the father I'd never known, the idealist who'd refused to compromise with injustice, the man who'd believed that systems should serve people rather than powerful men. I never knew my father, I told the assembled crowd, my voice carrying across the garden. I was born 2 months after he died. I don't know if he would have been a good father, if we would have been close, if he would have been proud of who I became. But I know what he stood for. And I know that silence didn't kill him. Silence just let his killer remain free for 25 years. Patricia Hendricks, who'd become an unexpected ally in this fight, spoke after me. She talked about her sister who'd lost her trust inheritance to excessive fees and died penniless. She talked about the conspiracy of silence that had protected Charles for decades, about how respectable institutions had looked the other way while vulnerable people suffered. "This garden is beautiful," Patricia said. "But it's not a celebration. It's a reminder. A reminder that we failed David Parker. We failed Eleanor Parker. We failed every person who tried to ask questions and was told to trust the system. This garden is our promise to do better." After the ceremony, I walked through Riverside one final time. I wasn't staying. California was home, now had been for 8 years, would be again. But I needed to make peace with the town that had raised me in shadow. I visited my mother at her new apartment, a modest 2-bedroom in a complex far from the mansion she'd occupied for 25 years. Anna had lost everything: the Montgomery name, the social status, the financial security she'd sacrificed so much to preserve. Her cooperation and testimony had secured immunity from prosecution, but she was paying a different price. Riverside society had ostracized her. James had divorced her, unable to forgive her betrayal. She worked part-time at a nonprofit, helping domestic violence survivors, rebuilding a life from pieces. We had coffee at her small kitchen table. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. I didn't know if I could forgive the woman who'd forged my signature, who'd married my father's brother while his body was barely cold, who'd raised me in the house of his murderer. But it wasn't hatred either, just two women who'd survived the same system, making different choices about how to move forward. I chose survival, Anna said quietly, stirring sugar into her coffee. You chose truth. I think you made the better choice. I didn't disagree. But I also understood that she'd been 26 years old, pregnant, terrified when Charles had given her an impossible choice. Understanding didn't erase what she'd done, but it provided context. I'm glad you're helping people now, I said. Domestic violence survivors need advocates who understand coercion. She looked up and I saw tears in her eyes. I do understand it. I lived it for 25 years. We talked for an hour, and when I left, we hugged. It was awkward, uncertain, the embrace of two people who'd spent a lifetime as strangers. But it was a beginning. My final stop was Riverside Cemetery, where my father was buried beside Eleanor. The headstones were simple, understated, exactly what both of them would have wanted. I knelt between them, placing white roses on each grave. You were right to fight, Dad, I said to the granite marker bearing the name David Parker, a name I'd carried without knowing the man behind it. Eleanor, you were right to finally speak. And I was right to finish what you both started. I stayed until sunset, watching the light fade over the cemetery, over the town that had held so many secrets for so long. Then I drove to the airport and caught the last flight back to San Francisco. On the plane, I opened my laptop and read the first draft of the memoir my publisher had commissioned. The title was Eleanor's idea from one of our last conversations, The Inheritance of Silence: One Woman's Fight Against the Family That Tried to Bury Her. I'd written the final line months ago, and reading it now still felt right. Some stories don't end with vengeance. They end with truth spoken, systems changed, and silence finally permanently broken. That's not revenge. That's justice. And justice is something worth inheriting. 3 weeks after the garden dedication, I was working in the David Parker Foundation's new office when Margaret forwarded me a letter that had come through our general intake system. It was from a woman in Oregon named Sarah Mitchell. She was 26 years old, and the patterns she described were painfully familiar. My grandfather controls the family trust, she wrote. I've tried asking questions about fees and distributions, but I'm told I'm being disrespectful, that successful families don't air their business in public. My inheritance is disappearing, and no one will help me because my grandfather is respected, powerful, connected. But I read about your case in the news. I saw what you did, and I realized, if you could fight back, maybe I can too. Can you help me? I read the letter twice, feeling the weight of responsibility and the spark of purpose that had sustained me through 18 months of legal warfare. This was why we'd built the foundation. This was why Eleanor had broken her silence. This was why David had died fighting. I forwarded Sarah's letter to Margaret with a note. I think this is exactly what we built the foundation for. Margaret's response came within minutes. I'll reach out today. Pro bono representation, full investigative support. Let's show her she's not alone. Sarah Mitchell was 26 years old, asking questions that powerful people didn't want answered, standing at the beginning of a journey I knew intimately. The cycle of silence was broken, and I, who'd once believed I was too powerless, too invisible, too insignificant to matter, had become the person who helped others find their voice. The story didn't end with Charles Montgomery dying in prison. It multiplied, spreading through every person brave enough to ask questions, every family willing to demand accountability, every system forced to choose transparency over protection of the powerful. And that I thought closing my laptop and looking out at the clouds below was the inheritance worth keeping. And that's how Rachel Parker, a 24-year-old woman who was publicly humiliated over $50, brought down a criminal empire that had lasted 25 years. Charles Montgomery, the powerful patriarch who made an entire town tremble, eventually died in prison at age 81, just 3 years after his conviction. But this story isn't simply about a villain getting punished or a brave young woman winning justice. It carries a much deeper message, a lesson that each of us needs to hear. Have you ever felt too small to make a difference? Have you ever witnessed something wrong but stayed silent because you feared no one would believe you, that the system was too powerful to change, that those in power would always win? If so, then Rachel's story is for you. Eleanor Parker stayed silent for 25 years out of fear. She witnessed the crime, she knew the truth, but she chose to live in silence because she believed Charles Montgomery was too powerful to be defeated. And during those 25 years, how many people were hurt? How many families lost their assets? How many elderly people died in poverty while their wealth was stolen? Silence is not strength. Silence is what allows evil to continue. Anna Rachel's mother chose survival over justice. She signed fraudulent documents. She followed Charles's orders because she believed it was the only way to protect her daughter. But in the end, her silence protected no one. It only created a system where Rachel grew up feeling invisible, unloved, excluded. Sometimes choosing short-term safety creates long-term danger. But Rachel was different. She chose to speak up, not because she was stronger than Eleanor or Anna, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she understood that silence has its own price, a price she was no longer willing to pay. And that's the most important lesson this story wants to convey. Systems only change when ordinary people have the courage to demand accountability. Charles Montgomery wasn't a monster born from nowhere. He was the product of a system that allowed powerful people to operate without oversight. He existed because the people around him, the people who knew the truth, chose to look the other way. The bank didn't ask questions. The police didn't investigate thoroughly. The community didn't dare speak up. And in the darkness of that indifference, crime flourished. But when one person, just one single person, decides that enough is enough, everything begins to change. Rachel didn't fight alone. She found like-minded people, Margaret Chen, Robert Torres, Diana Okafor, people who were also tired of watching the strong abuse the weak. She used the legal system not because it was perfect, but because it was the available tool. And most importantly, she refused to be bought, refused to stay silent, refused to accept that justice is only for those rich enough to purchase it. Today, the David Parker Foundation is helping hundreds of families across America fight against elder financial abuse. Victoria Parker, who was once Charles's weapon, is now helping victims of the very system she once served. Riverside established the Financial Justice Coalition to monitor trust management. And most importantly, people who were once afraid to speak up have now found their voices. This is why this story matters. Not because it's thrilling or dramatic, though it certainly is, but because it reminds us that change is possible. That an ordinary person can stand up to power and win. That silence is never the answer when we witness injustice. That systems are only as strong as our indifference allows them to be. So the question for you is, do you see something wrong happening around you? Is someone being abused, exploited, silenced? And more importantly, what will you do with that knowledge? Will you choose the safety of silence, or will you choose the courage of truth? If Rachel's story has touched your heart, if it's made you think about justice, about courage, about speaking up against injustice, please leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts. Have you ever faced a similar situation? Did you choose silence, or did you speak up? We want to hear your story. And if you believe that stories like this need to be told, that we need more people like Rachel Parker in this world, Please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Every subscription, every like, every share helps us continue bringing you meaningful stories. Remember this. You are never too small to make a difference. Sometimes all it takes to change the world is one person brave enough to speak the truth. And that person could be you. Perhaps you have an elderly parent whose trust seems mismanaged. Perhaps you work in an institution where you've seen something wrong but felt powerless to report it. Perhaps you've been told to stay quiet, to not rock the boat, to trust the people in charge. Rachel's story is proof that you don't have to accept that. That questioning authority isn't disrespectful, it's necessary. That protecting the vulnerable is more important than protecting the powerful. The inheritance Rachel truly claimed wasn't the $1.4 billion. It was her father's courage, Eleanor's eventual truth-telling, and the voice she found to speak up when everyone expected her to stay silent. That's the inheritance each of us can claim regardless of our bank accounts or family names. The inheritance of refusing to be complicit. The inheritance of demanding better. The inheritance of breaking silence. So tell us, what silence needs to be broken in your life? What truth needs to be spoken? What system needs to be challenged? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might inspire someone else to find their courage. Subscribe, like, and share if you believe that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary justice. Because they can. Rachel Parker proved it, and so can you. Thank you for listening to Rachel Parker's story. This isn't just her story, it's all of ours.